Let's talk about the 7 simple ways that you can help your body get in a more well-regulated metabolic state and lose weight. Now, your genes, like I said, do play a role, but they don't determine your destiny. Regardless of what your genes are and other health, everybody can start with these strategies. First, eat real food, right? Get rid of processed food, get rid of junk. If it ain't something that came from the ground or a farm, don't eat it, right? If it's mildly processed, for example, I had a can of mackerel today for lunch. I open it up, it's got mackerel in there, a little olive oil and some capers, salt. It's food that I recognize, right? It's a canned food, but still, it's real food. Eat lots of non-starchy veggies, lots of good quality protein, and lots of good fats. And you want to have fruit. Fruit's fine, but if you're really metabolically unhealthy, you might want to minimize the fruit. So lots of good fats are really important. That's another key principle, like avocados, nuts and seeds, extra virgin olive oil. Some people tolerate more saturated fat like grass-fed butter. But fats actually, when you cut down the carbs and you eat fat, it actually helps your metabolism. With one caveat, if you're eating starch and sugar and you eat fat, it's deadly. So you can't both eat, for example, a cookie is a lot of butter and flour. That's bad news, right? And as opposed to, for example, butter on your broccoli, which is good news. Really important. Also, avoid all the processed sugars, refined carbohydrates, ultra processed food. You can have some grains, fine, but limit your intake from bread, cereal, highly processed starches. Avoid baked goods, sweets, and alcohol. By the way, is not a health food, so that also is a form of carbohydrate and sugar, and is not good for you. Make sure you get the right nutrients, because a lot of us are, starving for good nutrients because we have a very nutrient poor diet, and we tend to eat more when it comes to our diet when we are nutritionally deficient. So a good multivitamin and mineral really helps. Vitamin D, fish oil, magnesium, probiotic, maybe fiber. All these can help balance blood sugar levels, and you can get them on our online store or any good quality outlet that sells good quality nutrients. Also, stress. Stress is a big factor. Stress could hugely impact your weight. Your cells are listening to your thoughts, and actually your metabolism slows down when you are stressed. It wreaks havoc on your health, your hormones, your weight. So do something that's going to help calm you down, whether it's yoga, meditation, deep breathing, try all those things. And there's lots more guided imagery. The list goes on. There's all kinds of apps and devices and Sensate and Apollo. There's lots of ways to do this. So I encourage you to just practice stress reduction. Next, sleep is super important. Sleep deprivation actually makes you gain weight. It makes you hungry. It makes you depressed. It increases inflammation, increases your risk of heart disease, diabetes. So make sure you get at least 7 or 8 hours of sleep, good sleep. Avoid artificial light at night from your phones and tablets, from television, electronics. Keep your room really dark. Keep it cool. Keep it quiet. And there's lots of other sleep hacks I've written and talked about. We have a whole sleep course, which we'll connect to in the show notes. Also, exercise is a great way to, activate all the pathways for longevity and health. You basically can't exercise your way out of a bad diet, but exercise is a critical step to build muscle, to build cardiovascular fitness, to regulate insulin. Even just taking a 30-minute walk after dinner has a huge impact on regulating your blood sugar and reducing your risk of disease. And that helps your body become more insulin sensitive, and that means less body fat, less inflammation, less belly fat. So just start with something if you're doing nothing, or do more if you're already doing something. You can do high intensity interval training. You can do strength training, but you need to do all of it, basically, if you want to stay healthy and live a long life. And I've written a lot about this. I've talked about it in my book, Young Forever, but make sure that you do the right kind of exercise, and that'll help speed your metabolism up. So bottom line, stop worrying about your genes. You can actually fix the gene expression by changing the way you live and what you eat, and everything from your diet to exercise to your sleep to your thoughts. And that's what's going to determine your health. It's not your genes. So much of what we think might be genetic is actually environmental. Our genes do predispose us to things, but they don't predestine us to things. We can actually change our destiny by changing our behavior and the influence on our genes from our environment. And how this works is through the influence of everything washing over your life. Like everything that you do, every bite of food you take in, every exercise you do, every stress you experience, every thought you have, every environmental chemical you're exposed to, all of these wash over your biology, wash over your genetics, and affect your gene expression. Your genes are fixed. You can't change those. But which genes turn on or off, you can regulate. So the entire field of epigenetics, which we've talked about before, is so important because it helps us to understand the ways in which our genes are regulated. Think of epigenetics as the piano player controlling the piano keys. The piano keys are your genes. They're fixed. You can't change them. There's 88 of them. Well, there's actually 20,000 plus genes. But anyway, you get the idea. And the epigenome is like the piano player that can play all sorts of music, from stuff that sounds like noise to the most beautiful song you've ever heard, right? So how does that work? And how do epigenetics work? It works through the influence of our environment. When I mean that, our lifestyle and toxins and our thoughts, everything washing over our genes, regulating how these are regulated. This is one of the most important breakthroughs in science and medicine. We actually use this to measure now our biological age, which I talked about in Young Forever. How we measure our epigenetic age is way we measure the rate of biological aging. I mean, chronologically, we get older every day, but biologically, we can get younger. Now, I think people think, oh, my dad had a heart disease, or I got diabetes in my family, or I got cancer in my family. I'm sort of doomed. But it's really not true. I think people blame their genes. Oh, everybody in my family was diabetic. Well, yeah, but it doesn't mean you have to be. And my grandfather was a great example. He was a laborer. He was deaf, born hearing, had spinal meningitis when he was 3, and was fully deaf, couldn't hear a word. And so he was a manual laborer his whole life, and he exercised every day. He actually he worked for the New York Times. He would throw the newspapers onto the truck every day. So he was really strong, and he walked every night after dinner. He liked to feed the neighborhood cats in New York City. And, he was a great guy. He used to do handstands when he was like 80 years old. And he actually did develop heart disease later in his life. But when we look at his brothers and sisters, and he had like 9 brothers and sisters, all of them had severe heart disease in their 50s. They all were educated and a little more sedentary and maybe didn't eat as well. And they ended up actually having bypasses and heart attacks and deaths in their 50s. So he lasted well into his 80s because he actually lived a very different lifestyle. So same genes, very different inputs, right? And I think, what you eat, how you move, how you restore your system, how you sleep, your thoughts, your feelings, your social relationships, all influence and regulate your gene expression. And those genes express who you are in this moment. It's called your phenotype. And you can regulate that, and you can turn on genes for health or genes for disease. You can turn on genes for weight gain or weight loss by what you do. Now, there are some genes that do predispose you to diseases, for sure. For example, I have genetics that make me more likely to have heart disease, but I'm good because I've done all the right things to not get that. Right? Some genes predispose you to diabetes. If you're we talk about some populations that are at high risk for type 2 diabetes or heart disease, but that is just a predisposition. It doesn't mean you're destined to get it. Now, what's interesting is that 90% of our current health is controlled by the environment that washes over our genes. We call this the exposome, what our genes are exposed to. It's the food we eat. It's how we exercise. It's our resilience. It's our mindset and our thoughts. It's our exposure to environmental toxins. So you don't have to just kind of be a passive recipient of what you think is your destiny, and that you're doomed to kind of be sick and be fat and whatever. You actually have control over this. So we're going to talk about how diet and lifestyle influence your genes, and what are my top strategies for actually regulating your weight, metabolism, and creating optimal health. So, they did a number of studies on genes and obesity, for example, and then let's talk about genetics and obesity. People say, oh, everybody in my family is overweight. But you all know those people who are like, everybody in their family is overweight, but they're thin and healthy, right? I've seen this over and over again because they've taken a different track in their life. But there was a comprehensive study that looked at 32 different genes that may predispose you to obesity. And they found that if you had all 32 genes, it would only account for about 22 pounds of weight gain. And that doesn't account for the massive change in obesity from when I was born, about 5% of the population to 42%. And now we have, 75% of the population overweight, 93% poor metabolic health. I mean, this is not because of our genetics, right? Some people, though, do have a high risk. And maybe most of the world has some degree of carbohydrate intolerance genetically, meaning they're more likely to get insulin resistant. When they have a certain amount of sugar or carbohydrate, their insulin level will go higher than the average person, right? Than me, for example. And that will make them more predisposed to getting type 2 diabetes or becoming overweight. So some ethnic groups are really at high risk. For example, Native Americans, Samoans, Pacific Islanders, people from the Middle East. I mean, if you're from the Middle East, your risk of diabetes is 1 in 4. In America, it's 1 in 10. It's actually the highest density of obesity, other than I think some of the Native American populations and the Pacific Islanders. Also, if you're Asian, if you're East Indian from India, you're higher risk, even at lower weights, of getting poor metabolic health and diabetes. So when they have sugar and starch, their body likes it really not very much, right? So they will produce more insulin. They'll get more weight gain. They'll get a vicious cycle of weight gain and hunger and fatigue and high blood pressure, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And it's actually unfortunate, because they don't realize they're like Dorothy with her ruby red slippers, and she can change her destiny anytime she wants. Just click her heels 3 times, so she can get back to Kansas. So we can all get back to our metaphorical Kansas, essentially, of our real, biology's ability to regulate our health. So what we need to do is understand how to eat and how to exercise and live that's going to be in balance with our genetics, right? We have to actually live in harmony with our genes. Now, we might like it, right? For example, I might really like sugar, but I might, be a Native American, and that's like poison to me. So I really can't do that. And so we have to understand that genetics load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So the Pima Indians is a great example. They had a metabolism that was really adapted to their environment. They lived in the desert in Arizona and Mexico. And by the way, currently, there are 2 populations of Pimas, one in Mexico, one in Arizona. The ones in Arizona, are the sickest population in America. 80% of them get diabetes by the time they're 30. Their life expectancy is 46. They have kids who are as young as 2 or 3 years old getting type 2 diabetes. They grew up in an environment that was perfectly set for their genes. They lived on foods that existed only in desert environments, acorns, they had jackrabbits, they ate, grew food. They were really well adapted. They were thin and fit 100 years ago with none of the diseases they have now, like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Yet in a single generation, they've become the most obese population in the world, second to the Samoans. Now, what happened, right? Their cousins in Mexico are thin, are healthy, don't have diabetes, same genetics. So what happened? Did the Pima Indians suddenly genetically mutate and get the obesity gene? No, they really ate a diet historically of squash and melons and beans and chilies and gathered foods like mesquite, acorns, cactus, chia seeds, herbs, fish. And their diet was really unprocessed, whole, and unrefined. And they were fit and healthy people, but then we came along, meaning we white people, gave them the white menace, which I call white flour, white sugar, and white fat, which is Crisco or shortening, and essentially shortened their life, which is what shortening does, and all the rest of it. And they came up with these traditional Indian foods. Fry bread, for example, it's not a traditional Indian food. It's basically deep fried flour in trans fats, and it's just deadly. So I think we have to understand that the genetics play a role, but because you have a predisposition does not mean you're going to get it. Now, how is genes connected to weight gain? Well, the Pima Indians studies show that environment plays a huge role, and fat in being overweight and weight gain. But they, for example, have a thrifty gene, which means they're really great at storing food when things are bad, right? So they might have a scarcity genes, which we all have. We're really well adapted to scarcity, not to abundance. So when you have the scarcity genes, you basically store fat. And it's a good thing. If you came across a bunch of stuff that would make you store fat, like a honeycomb or a bunch of fruit or something, and you would berries, you would eat that, you would gain weight, which would keep you healthy through the winter. But we don't need that anymore. We just keep eating all winter, right? So the other thing that happens is, there's genetics around pleasure and foods, for example, dopamine receptors and melanocortin receptors. And when you have certain of these genetic variations, you need more dopamine to make you feel pleasure. So one person can have 1 cookie to feel pleasure. Another person might need 10 cookies, right? So I think that's how we get into trouble with our genetics. But once you understand your genetics, you can personalize your diet and your lifestyle to actually match your genes. Now, sugar is really bad because sugar works on those dopamine receptors for all of us, even me, and it triggers the same response as cocaine or heroin. And when you stimulate those dopamine receptors, you need more and more over time to feel pleasure. And they set the stage for being addicted. And that's why heroin, cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, all these things work on the dopamine receptors, and they make you actually want more of the stuff and need more of the stuff to feel the same amount of pleasure. Now, when you look at the science on this, it's pretty frightening around food addiction. I wrote a book about it called The Blood Sugar Solution 10-Day Detox Diet, about how we deal with food addiction and sugar addiction. And it really provides a very clear roadmap on, in 10 days, how to completely reset your biology and get rid of the addiction to food and not crave the carbohydrates. Because if I said you use willpower, it's not going to work. You have to use science, not willpower. Now, when you look at these foods, what they do is they stimulate the brain. They did, for example, a study where they took guys who were overweight and they fed them a milkshake one day, and it was a high sugar milkshake. Now, they were the same study participants had different milkshakes on different days. When they fed them, and by the way, they were same calories, same amount of carbohydrate, same amount of protein, same amount of fat, same amount of fiber, identical, tasted the same. The only difference was in one of the milkshakes, the sugar, the carbohydrate, was a fast-acting sugar, which raised their blood sugar quickly, and the other was a slow-acting carbohydrate that raised their blood sugar slowly. When they had the fast-acting carbohydrate, they spiked their insulin more, their cholesterol went up higher, their blood sugar went up higher, their triglycerides went up higher, their insulin went up higher, their cortisol went up higher, their adrenaline went up higher. Remember, these are the same calories. It tastes the same. They don't know they're eating something different, right? But what was really disturbing was when they did a functional brain imaging, an MRI of the brain, they found the nucleus accumbens, which is the addiction center of the brain, lit up like a Christmas tree. So this area of the brain is what is the area that is the addiction control center, the pleasure center, the nucleus accumbens. And so the data on this is very compelling. I mean, they've done studies with the mice, which is not very ethical, but they basically put them in an electric shock cage where they would have an electrified floor, and they let them eat sugar, and they would keep shocking them while they were eating sugar, and they would keep eating sugar while they were getting electric shocks. And think about it, that's what's happening in America. People are getting fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. I mean, how do you get to like 300-400 pounds? It's not overnight. You can see it in the mirror, but people keep doing it, not because they want to be overweight, not because it's their fault, but because the food has hijacked their brain chemistry. So, it's really important to understand, how we need to regulate ourselves based on our biology. Now, the other thing is we're all different. So there's no one diet that works for everybody. And we shouldn't be trying to come up with the perfect diet. No, people say, oh, we should all be vegan. Oh, we should all be paleo. Oh, we should be all high fat. Or we should be all high carb or low carb. It really is individual. So you have to figure out what works for your biology, and it's by experimentation with yourself. We call this an N of 1 study. So you really want to find out what works for you and how you feel, what happens to your metabolism, what happens to your energy, what happens to your digestion, what happens to your other health issues. But most people do better with a diet that's higher in good fats and lower in starchy carbohydrates and sugar. I mean, there's a 1-year multi-center trial, controlled trial, a randomized study, which is hard to do in nutrition, but they did. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looked at 63 obese men and women. They were randomly assigned either a low carb, high protein, high fat diet, or a low cal, high carb, low fat conventional diet. So one was not restricted in calories, right? One was. The one that was restricted in calories, they didn't do as well, right? The low carbohydrate group actually lost more weight, had lower levels of triglycerides, cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugar, even though they weren't telling them to restrict their calories, right? They just ate more fat and less starchy carbs. Now, not everybody responds the same way. So we're all a bit different. For example, I know I need more carbohydrates. So I have to eat sweet potatoes, for example, or things like that actually are healthy carbohydrates, but have a little more starch, because otherwise I will lose too much weight. I probably shouldn't say that, but I will. So we want to actually make sure we are eating fewer starchy and refined carbohydrates. But based on whole foods, we can adjust our diet to be higher in fat or lower in fat, or higher in carbs or lower in carbs. And I think we just need to see how we feel. Pay attention to how you're doing. Your scale and your lab tests will help you know what's best. And there's ways to track this. I'm now co-founder of a company called Function Health. You can go to functionhealth.com and sign up for the wait list and become a member and be able to track your labs and your data on a regular basis at a very cheap price point to actually find out what's going on with you and have real-time feedback. So it's important that you track what's going on. And it's important to know what's right for you. For example, if you're a type 2 diabetic, you want to reverse that. And you're not going to reverse it by eating more starch and sugar. You probably need more of a higher fat, lower carb diet, maybe even a ketogenic diet. And that may be extreme in your mind, but actually, if you have an extreme disease like diabetes, you might need extreme interventions, right? Benjamin Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Some people need a pound of cure, which might be a ketogenic diet. Now, once you actually fix this problem and you become more metabolically resilient, then you can actually have a wider diet and more foods that may have been a problem in the past if you get yourself metabolically healthy and resilient. So what works for somebody else might not work for you. You have to figure out what works for you and how to personalize your approach to what you're eating.
I have patients who come in and they have such significant bloating that it's stopping them from being able to eat enough nutritious food, so they've had to really restrict their diet, or they don't feel like eating so much. And I have some patients, and we'll talk about one later, where they're getting thinner and thinner, and they're losing their lean muscle mass because the amount of bloating they're having is restricting their intake of nutritious food. And that is can be really significant for people. I mean, that doesn't happen to everybody, but there are people where they're dealing with it that significantly.
No, it's a big issue.
I mean, it's estimated that 20 to 30% of the population is dealing with bloating on a regular basis. People with irritable bowel syndrome, it's 96%. So people who are struggling with digestive issues or irritable bowel is, we've talked about before, that is something that we really work to define, greater than just putting that into a waste paper basket, right? It's even higher. It's at 96%. So bloating just means that your belly is getting bigger, right? You have this increase in abdominal girth, and it typically, when we're talking about abdominal distension from gas or bloating, what we're going to talk about today, it increases after you eat. So people will feel more bloated after they eat, or they may feel more abdominal fullness or sensation of gas as the day goes on. There's so many reasons behind the causes of bloating. And I think that's really what we want to focus on today, is what we really work to get to that underlying root cause in functional medicine, right? What is that underlying cause for that person? Because there's so many different reasons for bloating. And I think that's really critical to focus on, and not just saying, okay, well, take Gas X or just take something to suppress the bloating. Is we really want to figure out why is it going on, because that really then can help, work on that person's symptoms that are causing them a lot of discomfort.
And I think, when I was in medical school, we didn't really ever learn about what we call SIBO or SIFO. We didn't learn about that. Did you learn about that?
No, not in medical school.
It was kind of a new insight about irritable bowel, which is that it's really about not always, and we're going to go through the causes, but it's often about the overgrowth of bacteria or fungus, yeast in the small bowel. Now you've got like 22 feet of small intestine, about 10, 12 feet of large intestine. The small intestine is generally sterile, but sometimes the poop from the large intestine kind of migrates up, and we'll talk about the reasons for that, and leads to this bacterial overgrowth. So some conventional doctors now are treating people with antibiotics, right? What kind of things are you seeing them do?
Right. So you're talking about SIBO. So, we're checking, one of the major causes of bloating is SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of other reasons that people get bloating, but one reason could be because there's the wrong bacteria that have migrated up into the small intestine, as you have mentioned. And when that happens, that dysbiotic or not good bacteria, or the bacteria that shouldn't be there, consumes some foods and then produces gas. So it's consuming foods that get fermented, and then you produce a bunch of gas from it. And so the combination of certain foods, and not always bad foods, but certain foods that cause this gas when there's the wrong bacteria in the wrong place, can cause a lot of bloating. And so, SIBO is something we check for all the time. You can check for it with a breath test. Conventional doctors are checking for it as well. We check for it all the time. Yep, now they are. And there's a few ways you can work on treating that, and we'll delve into that more. But one is getting rid of the bacteria that's in the wrong place, and you can do that with medication like antibiotics, like you mentioned. You can do that with herbal substances that lower the bacteria in the wrong place. And you can also change the diet for a period of time that takes away the food that's feeding this wrong bacteria that's allowing it to overgrow.
So that's good. So conventional doctors are sort of getting the point a lot about SIBO, and they're using antibiotics, and then they'll use, different diets to restrict the fermentation of the foods, but they really don't have a comprehensive 360 approach from my perspective. They don't deal with the overall ecosystem of the gut. They don't look at all the other food sensitivities. They don't look at how to repair and rebuild the gut after the problem is taken care of with antibiotics. And they don't often treat yeast or SIFO, which is often coexisting with the SIBO. And then they end up, having recurrent bloating. So that maybe get better for a few weeks or a month, and then it comes back. So functional medicine has a very different perspective. We understand the problem, but then we also understand how to navigate like medical detectives to the cause. And, what I think is challenging with SIBO is it's just such a persistent and uncomfortable thing. And there's not a lot of insight about what really happens. So I would love it if you sort of take us through, what are all the types of reasons people can start to develop SIBO and all this and develop this fermentation process. Because by the way, the thing that struck me was such a big insight was humans don't make gas. It's the bacteria eating the food that you eat that make the gas. So if you have gas or bloating and you have dissension and air in there, it's not you making it, it's the bugs. And it's an imbalance in your relationship with your bugs. So you got to get in harmony with your bugs, basically. So take us through, Liz, what are the common reasons why we get this bloating and dysbiosis and imbalances in the bacteria?
I mean, one of the biggest reasons that we see that people get imbalances or dysbiosis, imbalances in their gut bacteria, are antibiotics. I mean, when we overprescribe antibiotics, or people have been on large courses of antibiotics for certain reasons, chronic infections, or they just, they got on too many antibiotics when they were younger. What happens is it can result in this imbalance in the good and bad bacteria in our system. It can get rid of some of the good bacteria and fungus, yeasts, and things that keep that ecosystem in better balance. So, too many antibiotics in our food supply. We know that things like that stress has a huge impact, because stress in our life impacts our motility and how well things move through our system. So, we know that people get bloating, this isn't just SIBO, but bloating because of, sometimes if they're eating too quickly, they're not digesting their food properly. So they are swallowing air or eating too quickly.
Probably that's what I do. I eat too fast. So that may explain some of my issues. So, yeah.
Moving on to the next thing. Right. So, I mean, and then there's, things like lactose intolerance, which is, lactose intolerance is so common. That's the decrease in that lactase enzyme that's in our intestines that breaks down lactose. And when we don't have enough of that lactase enzyme, then we can't digest our lactose very well, which is in dairy, And so we've done a lot of different podcasts on dairy and all of the issues. But what we know is that for everybody, by the time they reach 100, they become lactose intolerant. So everybody in the whole world is that way. And some people become lactose intolerant
so no cheese after 100?
Some people become lactose intolerant at age 2. Some people at 50.
I was just in Sardinia and I saw these old 100-year-old people eating a lot of goat cheese and sheep cheese, and they were doing good.
Well, and what do we know about when we say lactose intolerant? It's important to recognize it's a spectrum, right? So that there is, when you're, what does it mean to be lactose intolerant? It means you're not as tolerant to digesting as much of the lactose. And that's what gets people so confused all the time about foods and food sensitivities. They're like, well, I ate that yesterday and I was fine, but then today I'm really struggling. And it's really because of the volume, right? You can, many times you can get away with a certain amount of lactose, right? Yeah. And then other times, if you have 2 servings or whatever, then it pushes your body over the edge because you don't have enough of that enzyme to digest it. So it's it's a spectrum, and that's what we see all of the time. It's also important to recognize there's other things that can cause bloating. Things like constipation can cause bloating. We know not having good motility, maybe because of autoimmune processes or just a gastroparesis, like not good motility, right? Exactly. It's if your bloating is all the time, or if it's not getting better, you really want to get evaluated, because there are some cancers that can cause bloating, and GYN issues, gynecological cancers. So there's more things that can cause bloating. It's important that we pay attention to all of those when we're getting a really good history and timeline from our patients.
I agree. I mean, I think there's certain things, we see commonly, like the bacterial overgrowth. It's often because of people taking antibiotics or other drugs. In fact, one of the things that people really don't realize is that the acid blocking drugs, which are the third leading class of drugs sold in America, okay, these are like Prilosec, Protonix, Nexium, Mass Effects, all those drugs. They're given out like candy, and they cause bacterial overgrowth. And they cause fungal overgrowth because they change the pH, they change the environment. And so while you may not have heartburn, you end up getting irritable bowel. That's one of the side effects of these drugs. So I think it's important for people taking those to realize they're not lifelong drugs. There's ways to fix the underlying problem. And the other thing, that I found often is these sugar alcohols that are now in all these healthy products that are highly fermentable, non-digestible sugar alcohols, like erythritol, xylitol, sorbitol, maltitol, and they are in a lot of these foods. And some people do fine with them, some people don't. But I know if I have way back when, I think it was like 20 years ago when this stuff was just coming out, someone gave me this like sugar-free chocolate bar, which is full of maltitol. And I ate the thing at Kenya Ranch, and I literally couldn't see patients the whole afternoon because my stomach just was going crazy.
Yeah, you were doubled over in pain, right?
Oh my God. And then, I think you've got other things that I found clinically. I wonder if you found this too, is I don't know how much documented this is, but certain things like tick infections, like Babesia and others can cause motility issues in the gut, or heavy metals. Yes. So I often, if we don't get better initially, I start to look for other factors. So I think, so these are really common problems. And, 10% of all like loss of productivity in corporate healthcare is from irritable bowel. So it's a huge economic burden on society. And it's the number one reason for visits to the doctor for anything.
I mean, it's so important about the additives in foods. And sometimes people, that's something you really have to delve in deep with people on and look about, okay, what bars are you eating? What even certain, shakes that have, like you said, some of the sugar alcohols in them, chewing gum, people always forget about chewing gum and how much, that can cause bloating because of some of the sugar alcohols in them. And so you've got to pull those away just to help people feel better.
Absolutely. And I think, it's a bit of a detective job. And a lot of processed foods has emulsifiers and thickeners that tend to cause leaky gut and other issues. So there's just so much opportunity by focusing on a very detailed history to figure out what are the culprits. And if you're not eating anything that's real food, if you're eating anything that's not real food, it could be a thing like fructose is a big factor. A lot of high fructose corn syrup and stuff, and people have fructose intolerance. So there's a lot of issues that we can really deal with. So take us now, those are the causes, and those are the things we tend to think about and test for. We test for gluten, we test for food sensitivities, we test for a lot of things. What would be an approach that we would take typically to deal with these people with the food baby bloating thing? And let's just say it's kind of the typical kind of cancer or Lyme disease.
Right. I mean, exactly. Right. So you mentioned about the Lyme disease. That's really, I think, important when people are not getting better, when they're being treated so many times and they're not getting better. So we often will test for dysbiosis. So we're testing for SIBO. We also do stool testing that is, it's fascinating. Just some of the revelations we're having and improvements in stool testing. We can look at levels of good and bad bacteria and balances in good and bad bacteria and work to shift those as well, which can be really helpful. And one of the first things we always start with, of course, is dietary changes. So, we'll either put somebody, depending on their history, their story, and where they are and their level of motivation, we either put them on a dairy-free diet, or we put them on a gluten dairy-free diet, or we might put them on a low FODMAPs diet. So FODMAPs, people have heard about FODMAPs, and so it's important for us to just sort of delve into that a little bit. But FODMAPs,
yeah, what is that? What does that mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, so FODMAPs foods are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And so these are these carbohydrates that are not completely absorbed for some reason, either because of some maldigestion or just because they're harder to absorb carbohydrates. And then they get when there's the wrong bacteria in the wrong place, they consume those carbohydrates and produce gas. So so the oligosaccharides, those are things like wheat and rye and onions and garlic and legumes. Disaccharides are things like lactose and dairy. Monosaccharides are things like fructose, like high fructose corn syrup, like you mentioned, honey and apples.
Yeah.
The polyols, those are things like sorbitol and mannitol. The artificial sweeteners and some fruits contain some of these polyols. And so one of the first things we do is say, okay, maybe we should try a low FODMAPs diet for a period of time. So there are some foods on this list that are good, healthy foods that, you don't want to stay off of forever. So it's usually with a low FODMAPs diet, it's for a period of time that you're taking people off of these carbohydrates that are fermentable, and then over time working to reintroduce the healthy ones for that person. The Monash University has a really good website, lots of good resources on FODMAPs foods. And, but in general, you pull away things like wheat and rye and onions and leeks and cauliflower and apples and dried fruits and sugars and high fructose corn syrups and legumes. And you do that for a period of time. Not everybody needs to go to that level. And for many people, it's important that they work with somebody who's, a nutritionist or somebody who can help them navigate the world with this, because it can be, like I was mentioning earlier, you got to figure out what you're able to eat.
So then let's talk about some of the other sort of approaches besides the dietary restrictions that we would take. We would get off gluten, dairy, get off grains, get off beans, get off sugars, get off all the things that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Then what do you do for the bad bugs? How do you reset the gut? How do you sort of rebuild the gut?
Oh, great question. So, depending on what's going on in terms of the dysbiosis, right? Dysbiosis just means imbalance in good and bad bacteria and yeasts. And depending on what we find is going on, we will treat that. And so we can treat that with a prescription medication. So sometimes we'll use an antibiotic. I know that sounds kind of crazy because you're like,
counterintuitive, right?
We're like, we know antibiotics cause dysbiosis. True. But sometimes if people, depending on their level of symptoms, they do, we can improve symptoms with a short course of a non-absorbed antibiotic. So sometimes we'll use an antibiotic for a period of time, and then we'll use an antifungal medication. And then there are times...
you always follow the antibiotic with an antifungal?
Yeah. I mean, I often do. And again, it depends on what I find with the testing we do through stool testing and breath testing, and their clinical situation. So I often will follow with an antifungal, or I'll follow with an herbal medication that includes that there are many different herbs that we have. They have effect at both treating bacteria and yeasts. So we can use some herbal regimens. There's a lot of good ones out there that will treat both bacteria and yeast overgrowth. And that's one of the nice things about herbal regimens, I find, is that when you're resetting the bacteria in the gut and the yeast in the gut is, they may be a little slower to act, but they sometimes are really effective long term. So there's a few herbal regimens that we use very often, and some have been really well studied. We also do things that help the body with digesting their food, your food. So whether that's something that increases acid in the stomach, like betaine HCl, or a digestive enzyme, there's digestive enzymes that are plant-based digestive enzymes. And then there are other digestive enzymes that they comes from their porcine, their glandular digestive enzymes. Those things help with breaking down your food, your protein, your carbohydrates. They help with breaking them down so they're easier to absorb into the body and less likely to feed the dysbiotic bacteria that we were talking about. So,
that's great.
That's also really helpful.
So I think the unique thing about functional medicine is that you not only just sort of get rid of the bugs, but you focus on resetting the whole gut. And, whether it's an antibiotic and antifungal and herbs, and I'd love you to talk about what herbs, or then you add in enzymes and other pre and probiotics and repair components for the gut. It's what really helps people get better. Right.
Yeah,
so tell us about the cases you had. A 35-year-old guy, you had quite a remarkable story.
So, there's this gentleman, he was 35 and he came in to see us, and he was really frustrated with his bloating. And, what he said is that, he felt fine in the morning. And then as the day went on, he became more and more distended. He became more bloated in his belly and distended. And so it's really important, as I said, that we get really detailed clues as to his history. And, what really helps many times is when people take that really detailed history, and they think about their own timeline. When did this start? How long has it been going on? Trying to help get the clues as to what triggered this to occur for them, right? And, so we knew that as a child, he had ear infections. So he was on multiple rounds of antibiotics. But then 2 years ago, he developed a pneumonia, and he ended up, the first round of antibiotics wasn't helpful at getting rid of his pneumonia, and he needed a second round of antibiotics. And so we can also need to delve into this, this risk for pneumonia here and everything. But it was that those recurrent rounds of antibiotics. At that point, since that point, he's been struggling with bloating. So, he's been really, at that point, he started saying, okay, now every time I was eating, I was getting more bloated. And prior to that, he could eat whatever he wanted. He really didn't have to be careful with his diet at all. Now, if he noticed if he ate too much dairy, he would get bloating and diarrhea. We did do a SIBO test, and it was negative. But while we were waiting for his stool test to come back, we just decided, okay, let's pull away gluten and dairy. He wasn't really ready to go on a full low FODMAPs diet, and I didn't even know if it was really necessary for him right away. So we said, okay, let's pull away gluten and dairy. And when we did, he had significant improvement in his symptoms, and but not complete improvement. He felt better, but he still was getting some bloating depending on what he ate. And so the stool test came back, and it was really interesting. It showed a dysbiosis, right? It showed an overgrowth of many different bacterias and some yeasts. And so we then treated him with an herbal regimen. So we used something that had a combination of different herbs, oregano, berberine. It was a combination product. And he took it for 6 weeks, and he found that extremely helpful.
Wow.
We did add in probiotics. We did wait to add in probiotics till we were done with his herbal regimen. But once we did add in like a general probiotic. And there's so much to discuss with probiotics, but he found that to be really helpful. And now he's back to, he really is careful with dairy, but and has a really good healthy diet, but he's really much more comfortable all the time now. So,
well, let's talk about that. The probiotics, can be problematic. If a lot of people with irritable bowel, they go, oh, I'm going to take probiotics. And they go to the drugstore, or they go to the health food store, and they get the probiotics, and they take them, and often they get worse.
Yes.
So can you explain that there's an important order to doing things and that what would be beneficial at one point might be harmful at another point?
I think that's absolutely true. Order is really important. And, if somebody does have an overgrowth of bacteria in the wrong place, sometimes probiotics make that worse, and you can get, if you take a probiotic and feel more bloated or your digestion it feels worse, not better, then that's the wrong probiotic or it could be the right probiotic, but at the wrong time. So it's really important that, that you're either working with somebody who knows how to recommend what order of things to do it in, or, or just knowing that if it doesn't feel right to you, put it on hold. There's lots of different brands of probiotics out there and quality of probiotics out there. Some probiotics have dairy in them. And so for people who are dairy sensitive, they don't work. Other ones don't. There are also some strains of probiotics that can, in of themselves, depending on the milieu, increase the amount of bloating for certain people. So there are, it's hard to give a general recommendation. It's hard for me to say, well, take this one because it doesn't work for everyone. But just know that if you try one and it makes you feel worse, put it aside. And it may be that it's just not the right one for you, or it's one to try at a later date after you've gotten rid of the dysbiotic bacteria. Some people get a probiotic and they feel better right away, and then that's great.
Wow. Yeah, it's complicated. So if you're struggling with this, don't lose heart. There's a lot of things. I mean, you didn't mention histamine intolerance. There's a lot of things that cause problems, which we've covered a lot on the podcast. But the key is that, if you suffer from bloating, if you have this food baby, if you're really miserable and uncomfortable, all that, there is a way to kind of get through it and fix it. You want to know my secrets for living a long and happy and healthy life? Well, all you have to do is check out my weekly newsletter, Mark's Picks, where I share my favorite tips for health, longevity, well-being, and lots more. Check it out, and the link below. You also, I think you had one other case of a woman who was 25 and was also struggling. And,
I mean, she was
classic
also
history kind of
lots of antibiotics she had acne. So she was on lots of antibiotics for, between the ages of 17 and 22. And this is what we were talking about before. Her bloating was so significant at this point that it was preventing her from doing things. She wasn't, getting out during the day. She wasn't seeing friends all the time. She also couldn't eat as much. So, and just with her body type, if she wasn't eating enough calories or enough protein, she was starting to lose weight and she was getting underweight. She was also losing lean muscle mass. And this then creates this vicious cycle, because if you don't have enough nutrients coming in, then the body can't heal. I always talk to people about that. People are always restricting foods, which, the elimination diets can be so helpful. But sometimes if we're eliminating, and then not getting in enough nutrition, then the body can't heal. And this is what was happening with her. She was eliminating so much that she was wasting, her lean muscle mass was decreasing. She was feeling more weak. And if you
feel bad when you eat, you don't want to eat. And so you tend to lose weight.
Exactly. So she was just not eating, and she was more constipated. We did a SIBO test on her. It was positive. It was positive for both methane and hydrogen SIBO, but much more positive for the methane positive SIBO. And
we'll talk about that. So we do this testing, which is you breathe in this, you just drink this liquid that tends to cause the fermentation, right? And then you breathe into this bag, and you can tell whether it's hydrogen or methane, and each are different, and they actually respond to different treatments. So it's important to know which type of gas you're producing, because that means it's different bacteria. And so you need different drugs or different herbs for different bacteria.
That's so true. So what we know is that there's the methane producing bacteria are more likely to cause constipation, right? They're more likely to impact the motility in the digestive system and cause more constipation. And so the hydrogen producing bacteria are more likely to cause diarrhea. Now that's not always the case. Like sometimes people have their testing looks one way and it doesn't always match up. But in general, we see the methanobacteria, the methane producing bacteria, more likely causing a constipation picture and bloating. And so you're right. So sometimes the medication, there's a typical medication that is used, prescription medication that's used for SIBO called Xifaxan. But when you find the methane producing, it typically works better when you use it with neomycin together. You use both together. And she also did well when we put her on that low FODMAPs diet. We really pulled away. She needed a nutritionist on board because, as we were mentioning, she was becoming underweight. So she really needed somebody to guide her through. And as you know, at the Ultra Wellness Center, we've got all our nutritionists working with all our patients, which is wonderful. And so, they were really, her nutritionist was really helpful to guide her through the pulling away of the foods that were making her feel worse, but then getting her the nutrition she needed. And then slowly transitioning over time so she could add back in those healthy, higher FODMAP foods, right? Like the onions and cauliflower and fruits that we want to be able to add back in when possible. So after we treated her and got rid of that dysbiosis, she started to feel so much better. And nutritionally, she responded well, right? She was able to digest and absorb her food better, which is really important because when there's that imbalance going on, you're not digesting well, you're not absorbing well. She was getting weaker, right? So she was able to digest and absorb better, and she was nutritionally getting stronger and healthier, and her gut was healing, and we could add back in those good, healthy, higher FODMAP foods.
It seems to me that what you're saying is that this whole host of chronic diseases is driven by or affected by this phenomena of insulin resistance. And it's the biggest scourge causing 88% of Americans to have poor metabolic health. Second is,
and 90% of people with COVID to have it so bad they have to go to the hospital.
That's right. And the second thing is that we understand that the way in which insulin resistance is controlled is through primarily diet. And I want to go through a few of the other factors too, but primarily diet. And it's primarily the starch in our sugar, which is enormous in this country. It's 60-70% of our diet. It's usually in the form of flour and hidden sugars in our diet, or added sugars, about 152 pounds of sugar and 133 pounds of flour. Recently, according to USDA data, that's almost a pound a day of sugar and flour per person per day. It's staggering, which our human biology never was exposed to, right? We used to eat 22 teaspoons a year if we found some berries or honey. Now it's 22 teaspoons per day for the average adult and about 35 for a kid. And three, that by changing the quality of our diet, in other words, reducing starchy refined carbs and increasing good fats, or maybe even saturated fat, we can actually stop this process, which is underlying everything that goes wrong with us that leads to aging. And that there's some heterogeneity in the population, but we need to figure out, one, how to diagnose it. I want to talk about that. Two, then how to treat it. Because if we understand this is the problem, one, what do people listening need to do to find out if they have this problem? Let's start there.
Yeah. Well,
aside from the mirror jiggle test, the jiggle test.
Yeah. Well, I will try not to be too redundant to what you said, but I would say anyone who has any potential, get your insulin measured. And you'd mentioned some wonderful metrics. I've always said below 6. I think you said below 5. I think that's a brilliant way to do it. Now, at the same time, insulin, like every hormone, has a bit of a rhythm to it. There's a diurnal or circadian rhythm. So it's possible someone would go get their insulin checked and maybe it's 12 or 13 or so. And you and I both would say, oh, that's a little high. We need to be a little worried. But it's possible the person has measured it at a peak. And that in reality, that give it an hour or two later and it would have gone down to 5. It's possible. So I think it is important to note that there are other things, like challenging it in a dynamic glucose test, like you'd mentioned. That is the absolute gold standard. Alternatively, and another metric you'd mentioned is looking at lipids, because insulin controls the production of fats and the regulation of lipoproteins in the body, because lipoproteins are energetic molecules. And so look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And if a person has a triglyceride to HDL ratio and it's above 1.5, that's strong evidence that they're insulin resistant. Now, that ratio doesn't hold across all ethnicities. It starts to get a little loose,
Sure.
from Caucasians to Asians to African Americans or so. But nevertheless, that ratio of 1.5 is generally going to be a pretty good indicator that if you're lower than that, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is lower, that's a good sign that you're insulin sensitive. The good old-fashioned waist to hip ratio, or the waist to height ratio, if you measure your waist, like the biggest part around your belly, and if you multiply that by 2, if that number is higher than your height, that's a very, very good indicator that you have metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, to be more precise. If your waist circumference times 2 is less than your height, that's a good sign that you're generally doing okay. And then one other metric among many is what's on the skin. And there are 2 things people can look for on their skin, which are, it's almost proof positive of insulin resistance. The first one is skin tags. Those are these little kind of mushroom-like, or columns, little stalks of skin. They're not like a flat kind of round mole. They just sort of jut right up, and they're small. I bet everyone already knows what I'm talking about. People can get them in their armpits or around their neck if they have a fat fold around their neck. So those are skin tags. And in the same place, especially around the neck or the armpits, anywhere where skin is rubbing, they can start to develop something called acanthosis nigricans, or these patches of skin that are a little darker pigment, and they have a kind of altered texture, kind of this velvety kind of texture to it. But that's another one. So the skin, I kind of joke, the skin is the window to the metabolic soul, just because, like every part of the body, it responds to insulin. And so we start to see these little hints of it.
So that's really helpful. I wrote a little description of how to look at this in great detail, called How to Work with Your Doctor to Get What You Need. It's available on my website, drhyman.com. It's also available, I think, online. You can just Google it. And I go through all the diagnostic tests to help you identify the ways in which either you have insulin resistance or the consequences of it. And the things that I tend to recommend people do is, like you said, a fasting insulin, super important. The best test is because the fasting insulin elevation is really the second stage of the problem. The first stage is elevations of insulin after you consume a sugar drink. So that's a little bit of more of a pain in the ass test, where you have to drink a sugar drink. It's equivalent of 2 Coca-Colas, and then get your blood tested either 30 minutes after or 1 and 2 hours after, as well as fasting. That's really important. The lipid tests you mentioned are super important. I'm going to just drill down a little bit on that, because there's something called an NMR, or a cardiac IQ test from LabCorp Quest, which look at not just the total numbers of like the weight of cholesterol, which is your milligrams per deciliter. It looks at the particle number and the particle size, which is really important. And so when you have insulin resistance, you could have a perfectly normal cholesterol of 200 or 150, but your triglycerides may be 300, your HDL is 30. You're like, oh, your cholesterol is fine, your LDL is fine. It may not be, because you may actually have really dangerous small particles. Also, we look at, like the triglyceride HDL ratio is very important. It's something not really paid attention to much by doctors, but it's more predictive than an LDL elevation, more predictive. The most predictive tests are, triglyceride HDL ratio and total to HDL ratio. And the HDL ratio reflects the insulin resistance. So we've always been looking at it, but not in the right way. We also look at inflammation, which can happen through a CRP. We look at uric acid, which can be elevated, which David Perlmutter's book, Drop Acid, was all about. We look at liver function tests, which can be abnormal. We look at male hormones, sex hormones. We look at DHEA and sulfate in women to look at the effect of androgens being produced from the insulin resistance. So we look at a whole host of things, and we can get a pretty good picture of where people are in that spectrum. But the most important, like you said, is looking at the insulin fasting or after a glucose tolerance test. And you mentioned the waist to hip ratio. That's important. But, when you look at the data on the 88% of Americans who are metabolically unhealthy, only 75%, right? 75% of us are overweight, 3/4. But like, what about that other, 8%? Like probably about a quarter of people who are thin also have prediabetes. They're what we call skinny fat, or thin on the outside, fat on the inside. They're metabolically obese, but normal weight. And that's just because they may not gain weight, but the metabolic consequences are all the same. So we start to look at all these factors, and we get a pretty good sense of the problem and where you are in that spectrum. So now that we've established that, what are the top things that we should tell people to do in order to reverse this problem? Because we know even if you're far down the road, even if you've had this going on for 30, 40, 50 years and you're diabetic on insulin, that you can reverse this process, that you can reverse the damage to your beta cells, that you can increase your insulin sensitivity, and you can reverse type 2 diabetes, and not only just weight loss. So tell us about what are the top things that people need to do from a diet, lifestyle, medication, supplement point of view in order to actually reverse this problem of insulin resistance?
So one of the reasons I was invited to Singapore, specifically for my postdoctoral work, was because of the interest in that part of the world, looking at this disparity, or the inequality rather, with regards to metabolic predisposition and body weight changes.
Yes.
So for example, in Singapore, there's a tremendous variety of ethnicities, like here in the US too, frankly. But they noted that if you looked at a Chinese ethnicity, kind of the average Singaporean, and compared that with someone of European, like Northern European, like me and you, Caucasian ethnicity, that these were individuals who could both be gaining fat, and yet the Chinese ethnicity the Chinese guy, would start to suffer insulin resistance, hypertension much, much earlier than the Caucasian guy would. He could continue to get fatter and fatter, and only later would he start to experience the metabolic consequences. Yeah. Now, to varying degrees, this can happen across all ethnicities, where you'd noted that you have people who don't really appear to be overweight at all. They have a normal body weight. Much of this can be attributed to how the fat cells are growing. You know, you and I were joking earlier that what you can pinch and jiggle is the fat that you have. But you could have people who are both gaining weight, and yet, they're gaining weight. They both gained 20 pounds since they graduated from college when they were roommates. And yet how they've stored the weight, I don't even mean where, but how they've stored the weight is very different, because fat tissue can grow through two different processes. On one hand, you can have the number of fat cells capped, and that's how most people get fat across every ethnicity. The number of fat cells they have is set after puberty. Once they get to adulthood, their fat cell number is set. And so any pressure for the body to store more fat is primarily through hypertrophy of every individual fat cell.
So the fat
cells get to, and that's right, they get to about 4 or 5 times bigger than the normal fat cell. In contrast, there are some people, and Caucasians tend to do this a little more than other ethnicities, where they can continue to make more and more fat. So the fat cells will get a little big, and then the body just makes more fat cells. That's a process called hyperplasia. So just multiplying the fat cells, basically. That's the difference, because if you have small fat cells, even if you have a lot of them, they're very insulin sensitive and they're anti-inflammatory, literally secreting proteins that are anti-inflammatory. In contrast, when fat cells start to hypertrophy, 2 terrible things happen. One, they become insulin resistant to try to prevent their own growth. They're basically telling insulin, you want me to keep growing? I can't grow anymore, so I have to become resistant to you. And so the fat cell starts leaking free fatty acids into the blood. At the same time, as the fat cell's getting so big, they're pushing each other further and further away from capillaries, from the blood. And thus they become hypoxic, or a little oxygen deficient. And so they start releasing pro-inflammatory proteins, a whole catalog of them, because some of those pro-inflammatory proteins will increase blood flow. They'll try to increase the production of new capillaries. So that is part of what happens across people. Even though their body weight may be normal, they might not be in any category that would be problematic with waist to hip ratio or waist to height ratio, but they have more hypertrophic fat cells than someone else does. And hypertrophic fat cells are insulin resistant and pro-inflammatory. Yeah. So thus driving the metabolic problems.
And we see that in Indians, from India, Chinese, Asians. It's very similar. They really don't have to be very overweight, and they can just have that teeny little belly bump, and that little belly bump is kind of a hot potato. So it's an issue. Okay, so let's go back and go. We understand the diagnostics. How do we test? How do we advise people in the confusing nutrition world today about what to eat? Because we have the vegan community saying veganism is the cure for diabetes. And we have the keto folks saying keto is the cure for diabetes. And we have me somewhere in the middle saying vegan diet is good. Yeah. And so we really have to kind of go, well, what's the deal? How do we actually get to the end goal of reversing this. And of course, it's going to be personalized because some people, like I said, have myriad other causes like stress or inflammation or the microbiome issues or toxins that need to be addressed as well. I mean, I've had a woman lose 40 pounds just like that by getting rid of her mercury. So there's more complexity to it. But for the predominant group of people who suffer with obesity and diet and this phenomena, what are the top recommendations from a diet, lifestyle, supplement, medication point of view?
Yeah. So with regards to exercise and
I know you're not a doctor, a medical doctor.
That's
I am,
right.
But I want to hear what you have to say about the food and what you've learned through your research.
Yeah. So just purely as a scientist, to mention, because you'd mentioned kind of three things, and I agree with them: kind of medications, exercise, and diet. With regards to the exercise, I keep
said
that
supplements
one very simple,
too.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So with regards to exercise, my view is whatever the one is that you'll do it. So the best exercise to improve insulin resistance is the one you'll do. And there could be varying degrees there, but it really is a matter of just getting out and doing something. And I would just say the only addition to that is do something after you've eaten your most starchy, insulin spiking meal of the day. Whatever that one is, then that's exactly right. Go out and take a walk, and people would be dumbfounded at how much it lowers their glucose and their insulin. Because the moment you start moving those muscles, they don't need insulin to tell them what to do. They just start pulling in their own glucose. They get so greedy, so demanding, that they don't have to wait for insulin to open those glucose doors. They open them on their own, driving down the blood glucose, which helps the insulin stay much lower than it would have been otherwise. So movement matters, no question.
15-minute walk, 10-minute, half an hour, like what?
Yep.
How long?
Yeah. Well, the longer the better, and the brisker the better, but anything is better than nothing.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, with regards to supplements, there are certainly, and you would know more about this than me, so in all sincerity, I would readily defer to you, but some that I'm aware of, supplements like berberine, no question. Cinnamon also has been shown to do something. Vitamin D as a vitamin.
Yeah.
Yep. And alpha lipoic acid, magnesium. Yep, that's right. So there are several things that people can just sprinkle in and use judiciously to help.
Yeah.
And medications, I'm not sure. Maybe that's too big.
Omega-3 fats. Omega-3 fats probably help.
Oh, for sure. That's right. Yeah. Yep.
So omega-3 fats, vitamin D, lipoic acid, berberine, cinnamon. Yep. That's a good start. Yep. And there's more. There's more.
Oh, yeah. And you would know more about
biotin,
this than me. Yep.
Biotin and chromium and vanadium and many other nutrients are needed, B vitamins, all that. But basically, if you take a good multivitamin and you supplement with some magnesium and lipoic acid, and you add cinnamon in your food, or maybe take berberine capsule, that can help. And there's more to this, and I've written a lot about it, but I think that's good. Talk about the next piece, which is
yes. So the next piece could be medications, but maybe just for the sake of maybe that's too much of a big black hole. I would say in general, maybe I'll just say this: metformin is the most widely used insulin sensitizing drug in the world. Because it's affordable and it's effective. But even metformin, which is considered the best, is only half as effective at improving type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance compared to even modest lifestyle changes. So even if you take the very best of all the medications, a prospective study in humans found that it was only 50% as effective as lifestyle changes. So that then brings us to
You got to send me that study, Ben.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. So now, Mark, you would be the authority with many, many other aspects to this, maybe even diet. I will only focus on nutrition just because that's the one I've focused the most on. Despite my studies looking at stress hormones like epinephrine and cortisol, which absolutely cause insulin resistance and tremendously matter. Inflammation, which absolutely causes insulin resistance. And I've published in labs and papers on both of those topics. But to me, the elephant in the room is nutrition. And I like how you both of us want to be diplomatic when it comes to nutrition. I don't want to, in all sincerity.
I don't care.
I don't like, but I think it's appropriate for us
I want the truth.
Yeah, same. And the truth is, compared to a standard American diet, which is not totally fair to the US because it's really a global diet at this point. So compared to the standard diet that people are eating, any change is going to be a benefit.
Yes.
It really, at the risk of oversimplifying it. This is why someone can go very strict vegan, which I think is a diet that has a problem long term, as a person may start to develop nutritional deficiencies. But even still, if you go on a vegan diet, there's no question you will lose weight and your insulin sensitivity will improve. At the same time, there's no question, I've published a clinical paper in collaboration with a local clinic here, that you take people with full-blown type 2 diabetes, put them on a calorie-unrestricted low-carbohydrate diet, and the diabetes is gone. So both of these clearly work. And so in my mind, the improvement, the steps to improve insulin resistance can start with one of two steps. One, controlling energy, or two, controlling insulin. And on the controlling energy side, this is why a vegan diet is, in my view, generally going to be successful. Not always, because there's a lot of garbage that can be considered vegan.
Yeah.
But it's because
it's typically a high carbohydrate diet.
That's right. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yep.
I mean, grains and beans, even if they're whole, are still more carbohydrates than eating protein and fat and vegetables.
That's right. Yeah, very insulin spiking. Yep. That's true. So in general, if a person is eating a diet that is just overall lowering their calories matter. And so if there's a lower calorie diet, you will lower your insulin, because you cannot have elevated insulin in the midst of a low caloric consumption. You'll die. Because if calories are low, but insulin stays really high, then you are clearing, your glucose will be too low, your ketones will be too low, and your brain will starve and you'll go unconscious. So the two are really antithetical. So if you are lowering your calories, if you're lowering your calories, then your insulin will come down, and then you'll start to improve your insulin sensitivity. That absolutely happens. Now, however, having said that, I think that sets you up to failure. So if your first step to improving insulin sensitivity is to cut your calories or cut your energy, then you're going to be fighting a battle with hunger, and usually hunger wins. That's my only concern in that regard. But nevertheless, it absolutely will improve insulin sensitivity.
And by the way, just to stop you there for a second, that's what our friend David Ludwig's book was called, Always Hungry, which explains why we're always hungry. And if we are battling hunger and our lizard brain is in charge, which it is, which is survival, we're not going to win. Our frontal lobe cannot match the power of our reptilian brain to search out, seek, and find something to eat if our blood sugar is low and our insulin and blood sugar are spiking up and down.
Yep, that's right. In fact, I think to be a little crass, perhaps, this is why I believe you do not see reunion tours with The Biggest Loser TV show. That game show where you have these people going through tremendous caloric restriction by following the classic advice of eat less, exercise more. They do it to an extreme, and hunger always wins, and they gain it all back. And so you don't see them 2 years later or so because the results are not favorable, very unfortunately. But nevertheless, there's the low energy paradigm, which fits with veganism generally, because by cutting so much fat, typically calories are going to drop tremendously. This is why fasting will work very, very well. But on the other hand, you have this paradigm of just control your insulin. And this is what we published a paper on, where these 11 women with type 2 diabetes, they were told, don't count your calories. If you're hungry, eat until you're full. When you're not hungry, don't eat, but just follow these 3 rules. And I have an affection for alliteration, and it was control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And just to put a little nuance with each of them, control carbs is something you and I have been talking about, which is focus on fruits and vegetables, eat them, don't drink them, and don't get your carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. Prioritizing protein, this just makes sure you're getting high quality protein and you're getting plenty of it. It will promote a greater sense of satiety. Protein increases metabolic rate through the process of digesting it, and you need it. And then lastly, don't fear fat. My paradigm on that one, fat has no effect on spiking insulin on its own, and focus on ancestral fats, which is animal fats and fruit fats. We've been eating fruit fats for millennia, because our ancestors would have only needed to take, that's right,
avocado, coconut, and olives.
And olives, that's exactly right. Because all our ancestors had to do was take the flesh of the fruit and then just press it, even with their own body weight, and they would have gotten that oil from it. And so we've been using that for millennia. And it's these modern, of course, refined seed oils that have only come on the line over the last century, most especially the last 60 years or so. When the war on saturated fat began, we were desperately looking for alternatives, and that took us to all these refined seed oils. So don't be afraid of those, but don't fear the ancestral fats. So my view on
I'm going to just frame this a little bit. I have a very good friend who I love to pieces, who happens to be the dean of Tufts School of Nutrition Science and Policy, Dr. Dariush Mazafarian, who's published more studies than God and is one of the most brilliant and humane people I know. And we agree on 99% of everything except for this point. And his view is from the data, both interventional data and observational data, that high doses of refined seed, bean, and nut oils are actually healthful and are not a problem. Can you just kind of address that in the context of what you know? I don't know if we're going to get to the answer, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
So I do attempt to have a bit of a nuanced view on this because I'm an insulin guy. I'm not a fatty acid or I'm not a seed oil guy. And there are people who are seed oil guys and gals. I'll speak to what I know, which is two things. One, when linoleic acid, so we're eating like 50 some thousand times more linoleic acid now than we were 100 years ago. And I think that matters. So when we eat linoleic acid, which is the primary polyunsaturated fat in these refined seed oils, that will accumulate in our fat cells, and it gets metabolized into a molecule called 4-hydroxy-nonenal, or 4-HNE. Other fats do not do this. They do not go down this metabolic pathway. And when a fat cell is accumulating this byproduct of linoleic acid, it forces the fat cell to go down the route of hypertrophy. Kind of reminiscent of what we'd spoken about before. It prevents this process of hyperplasia, allowing smaller but healthier fat cells. It forces the fat cells to only grow through hypertrophy, which promotes inflammation because they become hypoxic, and promotes insulin resistance because they can't grow anymore. So that absolutely happens. I can say that definitively. That is one negative. The other negative thing that I can speak to is similar to this, although that is admittedly more my forte, but so much of the evolution in our understanding of atherosclerosis is not just that cholesterol and fats matter. Something has to happen to those fats for them to be considered pathogenic or harmful.
Oxidized.
For example, that's exactly right. Yep. You can take a macrophage and have it swimming in a little bath of lipoproteins, of various fats.
So one of your white blood cells floating around all your fat cells, right? That's
right. Yeah, or floating through the lipoproteins, passing them in the blood. And so you have a little macrophage which is floating in the blood. And if it's bumping into lipoproteins like LDL, for example, it will not engulf them. If the LDL is unaltered, if its fats and cholesterol esters are in a natural native state, they're not considered a problem, and the macrophage ignores them. This was studied by a group at UT Southwestern, a legendary group. And in fact, these guys won a Nobel Prize, not for this work, but for other stuff. They found that you could only induce a macrophage to start eating these lipoproteins if the lipoproteins had oxidized fats on them. And now you start to create what's called a foam cell. And that's one of the primary components of an atherosclerotic plaque. Like when you actually look at the blood vessel that's growing, you have these, they look like little bubbles. They look like they're foamy. Yeah. They look like they have air bubbles in them because they have these little pockets of fat. But and those are macrophages that start eating fats, but they only eat the fats if they're oxidized. And Mark, you cannot turn a saturated fat into what's called technically a peroxide. That's what these actually are, unless you heat them up to like 300 Celsius, a lipid peroxide.
Whoa,
saturated fats. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Saturated fats are they're the most stable fats in nature. And the more you unsaturate the fat, like a polyunsaturated fat, now it can become a lipid peroxide very, very readily. And there are these metabolic pathways that will do that. And so we take this linoleic acid that we're eating 56,000 times more now than we were a century ago. And now we see that as these become oxidized, macrophages sense them as problematic and they will engulf them. And now you have a foam cell, which becomes very pro-inflammatory. And you basically have the heart of an atherosclerotic plaque.
So basically,
those are my concerns.
So basically, those concerns, just to recap, is if you eat a lot of refined processed oils, which is the predominant oils used in America today, about 10% of our calories is soybean oil.
That's
if you eat that, that pathway to metabolize that oil creates something called 4-hydroxy-nonenal, which actually goes into the fat cells and causes them to grow. And the second problem is that these fats are very unstable. They're called polyunsaturated fats, but they're very unstable, so they're easily oxidized. And oxidation happens from lack of antioxidants in our diet, basically the phytochemicals, from stress, from our microbiome, from anything that triggers inflammation. So anything that causes oxidation, which is a lot, radiation, that causes the lipid peroxides. And that is what our immune system responds to, which is what causes heart disease. So we now know that heart disease is an inflammatory disease. And what you just described was the mechanism by which that happens. White blood cells attack fat particles running around your blood if they're oxidized, and then deposits them in your arteries, which then cause heart disease.
Yes.
The question I have for you is, are those Petri dish studies, or is this broader in its application? Because what Dari says is that, yes, and when you look at the actual population data and interventional data, we don't see this. It sounds good on paper, but is it actually real?
Yeah. So I'm admittedly a mechanistic kind of guy. So I'm definitely citing Petri dish or direct cell reactions. But even in human populations, we see the correlation, if not the causality. And Mark, that's the underlying concern with all of this. You simply cannot induce. You can't do these causality studies in humans that I'm aware of. At least I don't know that they've been done. But in humans, we know that when you sample the atherosclerotic plaque, the actual amount of oxidized LDL is going to be the the circulating LDL that's oxidized will be a predictor that will determine the degree of a person's atherosclerotic blocking or prevalence. So we see the correlates in humans, if not the causality that we can see in the cells and in the rodents.
I mean, look, from my perspective as a doctor, it's like, if there's potential problems, why risk it? Maybe it's okay, but we do know that olive oil, avocado oil, for most people, coconut oil, fats in their original state, and animal fats, particularly grass-finished animals, wild animals, particularly nuts and seeds in their whole forms, those are fine to eat, and that's where we should be getting our fats. So I think that's a really helpful point. I think you did a brilliant job of explaining what we need to do. I wish we had, hours and hours to talk about this. And I think the dietary strategies of cutting out starch and sugar, don't drink your calories, avoiding boxes, bags, and barcodes, upping your protein a little bit, high quality protein, eating the right good fats, key. Exercise, I think any is good. Interval training, high intensity interval training, which increases VO2 max, and strength training, which improve mitochondrial function and muscle mass, are also really critical. Meditation, stress reduction, all that stuff we talked about. I want to finish by talking about this whole thing that we earlier talked about, which is mTOR. And I don't know how much of you know about this, but probably a lot more than I do. It is the essential question that's running around the longevity fields. And there was one large study that was done that looked at protein intake over the years of a person's life. And it seemed like when they were younger, if they ate less protein, they did well. But as they got older, they didn't. They needed more protein in terms of longevity. And I remember there's one story of Emma Morano, who was a Italian woman who lived to be 117 years old. And Walter Longo, who's a longevity expert, has written about her, talked about her, met her. And apparently when she was younger, her doctor told her she was anemic and she needed to eat 3 eggs a day, which she ate for her entire life. Then in her 90s, she was starting to dwindle, and her doctor told her to eat a pound of meat a day. And she lived to be 117 years old. And so the question I have for you is, and this was a really brilliant new understanding for me, which is that the biggest driver of increases in mTOR, which is a regulator of aging, higher mTOR, faster aging, is too much insulin, which comes from too much starch and sugar. Also, protein also will increase mTOR, right? So if you're then wondering what is the best strategy for regulating mTOR and aging, because a lot of people are saying restrict protein, be a vegan, restrict protein, that's going to make you live longer. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really convinced because, I look at the data, for example, on the Native Americans, the Lakota, who at the turn of the 1900s were the longest lived population. They had more centenarians than any other population, and all they ate was basically buffalo. And a few berries, and so help us unpack this mTOR story, in like five minutes, because then we have to stop.
Yeah, so I'm thrilled to circle back. In fact, I think you framed this perfectly, and I'm kind of somewhat relieved to hear how you're framing this, because I think it means that you and I see this eye to eye. So these kinds of studies are very difficult to do in humans. Of course, everyone listening understands that you just can't feasibly follow humans throughout their whole lives and look at and perfectly scrutinize their diet and how it influenced their longevity. It's so complicated, but more and more. In fact, a paper was just published a couple weeks ago called the Inchianti study that somewhat reflected what you said again, that even Walter Longo's own research found that the oldest, that meat consumption, animal protein consumption, the older we get, has an inverse association with mortality. In other words, the older we're getting and the more animal protein we're eating, the longer we're going to live. And then there appeared to be this period in Walter Longo's prospective kind of research or correlational studies. He found that there was this kind of at around middle age, I think it was 50 to 60 or so, and you might know this more than me. They found that the people who ate the most meat did have the highest mortality, but then it ended up shifting into the exact opposite at above 65 or 70. And so all of this is correlational, of course, so it's very difficult to state anything conclusive. Based on the sum of all evidence, in my mind, cutting protein is a wonderful way to make sure your bones and your muscles will be more frail and you will be more frail, easier to kill, so to speak.
And by the way, your immune system requires protein to make the antibody. You hear about antibodies and COVID? Where do you get those? From protein.
Yeah, you need those amino acids. Yep, that's right. So in my view, we should not be fearing protein. We should be prioritizing it in the diet and high quality sources of it. Especially. And the fact is, although it's a little inconvenient sometimes, animal protein is imminently absorbable, and you at least know you have every amino acid you need. I'm not saying that plant protein can't be a part of this. It absolutely can, but there's also no question animal protein is fantastic. And so now I appreciate there's other issues that come into play here, moral issues and ethical issues, but even still, whatever it may be, prioritize protein. Because it's going to make you harder to kill, including just disease and longevity. And then so that's the thing about just animal protein in general. Then
so how does that work with mTOR then? Because I think that's what I agree with them. I mean, the muscle building. I mean, you can get, movies like Game Changers and others show that you can be vegan and be ripped. But I've interviewed some of these folks, and they are pounding highly processed protein powders, vegan protein powders, because they cannot get the muscle building effect without supplementing branched chain amino acids and high doses of protein powders. So you cannot get, because otherwise you'll see a lot of vegans are relatively thin and have low muscle mass over time. Obviously if they stay on it for a while, but the ones who are ripped are the ones who are actually, kind of eating super physiologic amounts of these plant proteins that you couldn't get by eating them. The whole plants.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's sort of reflective of my general view that the further someone's going from animal-based foods, the more they need to supplement in order to ensure that they don't have any deficiencies. Now, so mTOR is relevant, and animal proteins will activate mTOR more than plant proteins will. And that matters if we are continuing to say that mTOR is the root of all aging. However, that I believe it's not relevant for longevity, because when we spike mTOR with proteins in the diet, it is very transient. It comes up and it comes down, and it's based wholly on the amount of amino acids that are getting pulled into a cell. And of course, muscle cells will pull in the bulk of those amino acids because they have such a high protein demand. And that's a good thing, because you have to have mTOR turn on and then turn off. You have to have this cyclical mTOR activation. I have a colleague 2 doors down from my office right here who studies mTOR and its effects on muscle and bone growth. And what he's found, and others, that when you have mTOR turned on too long, you actually start to become mTOR resistant, and that the muscle cell is trying to grow, but mTOR has been on it's so high for so long that its ability to promote muscle protein synthesis is compromised. And now the muscle is starting to break down its protein, even though mTOR is elevated. But that happens when mTOR is elevated too much, which is not the cyclical activation you get from protein consumption, but rather the insulin-induced mTOR activation.
Yes.
Because insulin, as I said, insulin activates mTOR much longer than amino acids do, and importantly, much more ubiquitously, Because if you and I were to eat a load of amino acids, we would get significant mTOR activation in our muscles and relatively little mTOR activation in our liver or our white blood cells. Mm-hmm. However, because they don't pull in amino acids very much, it's a very modest intake of amino acids, and so that's relevant if it's protein-induced mTOR. But insulin, when we spike our insulin, as I mentioned earlier, literally every single cell in the body responds to insulin. There's truly no exception. I'm not being dramatic here. There's no exception. And so now we have our white blood cells that are responding to this elevated insulin, and our skin cells and our bone and muscle and liver and brain. And so now mTOR has been spiked and it's staying on for longer. And right around the time mTOR is starting to turn off in response to this insulin spike, what do? We turn it on again and again and again by continuing to eat and drink refined starches and sugars essentially every 2 or 3 hours from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed.
Bad news. Yeah.
So if mTOR matters, then focus on insulin, not protein.
That is a brilliant summary of something that I've struggled to understand, because intuitively I knew that protein, and also from the data, that protein as we get older is really important for muscle mass. And sarcopenia, which we talked about on the show, the loss of muscle is the single biggest driver of age-related disease, because it just accelerates everything. It accelerates insulin resistance, inflammation, hormonal dysregulation, high cortisol, low growth hormone, frailty, everything else. And so you need that. But at the same time, I'm like, well, geez, I don't want to be messing up my longevity here by eating my, grass-fed ribeye, And the explanation of that, it's actually sugar and starch that keep mTOR elevated all the time, as opposed to the cyclical nature, which protein does, is just brilliant. So the take home is cut out the starch and sugar. If you eat a lot of protein with a lot of starch and sugar, you're a problem. If you're eating a lot of fat, particularly saturated fat with starch and sugar, it's a big problem. That's a caveat I want to make for people. Oh, saturated fat's good. I can eat saturated. No, not if you are eating starch and sugar, because then it's like putting gasoline on a fire. We're in an interesting moment in society where we're fatter than ever. We keep talking about it for decades. I have been, you have been, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Our government recommendations and policies don't seem to be solving the problem. And certainly the advice we're getting from our doctors and nutritionists often is not effective either, which is eat less and exercise more. It's just calories in, calories out. Have you written a lot about this in the past? And recently there's been a real movement to look at radical different ways of solving some of the biggest problems we have, which is diabetes and obesity, using a ketogenic diet. And for those who are listening, a ketogenic diet is essentially a 70% fat diet, cuts out almost all carbohydrates, and has moderate amounts of protein. It's definitely not exactly an Atkins diet. It's a little bit different than that, and it's been around for a long time in medicine, but it's recently being used for all sorts of conditions, from cancer to diabetes to Alzheimer's, and it's been used for decades for epilepsy by neurologists. So you really become an expert on these issues as a non-doctor scientist. You probably have read more of the scientific papers and more of the data on this than most doctors or scientists. And you've been busting a lot of the big myths that really we are facing in the world of food. And the first myth that you really took on back in 2002 with that article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, was that we should all be eating a low-fat diet to lose weight, because fat has more calories than carbs. So if we all ate Snackwell cookies, we lose weight, except for one thing: the opposite happened. So what led you in that whole trajectory of this sort of examination of the low-fat movement to swing so far the other way, to write a book called The Case for Keto: Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating? What made you go, I need to write a book about this?
Okay, well, when I first...
And by the way, this is the book. Everybody should get it. It's really, really awesome. It's got a nice red cover. You can't miss it. And it's beautifully written. It's great prose. It's just awesome.
Yeah, thank you again. So so that New York Times Magazine article was a third of my investigative reports on nutrition. So I started off just by chance writing about salt and blood pressure for the journal Science. And I had no idea there was an enormous, very vitriolic controversy in the field, the basis of which was that there's surprisingly little evidence to advise us all to eat less salt. And while I was doing that work, I realized that one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and I had written a book called Bad Science, had taken credit not just for the low salt diet we were all eating in the 1990s, but the low fat diet as well. So then I did a investigative piece for Science. It took me a year. Published. It was called The Soft Science of Dietary Fat. And it just turned out that, again, the evidence, the idea that dietary fat causes heart disease was an interesting hypothesis that was launched kind of in the beginning of the 20th century and then took hold in the 1950s and never panned out. Did experiment after experiment to try and test it. And the experiments, sometimes they showed that people ate less fat, lived a little longer. Sometimes they showed that they died a little more prematurely. And scientists fell in love with the hypotheses, as scientists often do. The public health establishment in this country started promoting it, and we believed it ever since. So in 2002, when I did this New York Times Magazine article, initially the idea was that I just wanted to find out what started the obesity epidemic. It was our awareness of it was relatively new. Obesity rates shoot up in this country roughly in the 1980s. And it coincides with some shifts to nutritional advice. We go from eating sugar to eating high fructose corn syrup. So that was one hypothesis. Michael Pollan bought into that idea and was promoting it. And the other was just that we started promoting this idea that a low-fat diet was a healthy diet and that carbohydrates were heart healthy diet foods, when carbohydrates had always been perceived as kind of uniquely fattening. Starches, breads, and sugars, the kind of thing that, people would say they go right to my hips or right to my gut. So I was reporting that story for the New York Times Magazine, and while I was doing it, it turned out I stumbled on 5 clinical trials, really the first 5 that had ever been done, comparing an Atkins ketogenic diet to a low-fat diet, the kind the American Heart Association was telling us to eat. And none of these studies had been published yet, but they'd all been discussed in conferences, and they all found the same thing, that if you tell someone to eat a high-fat diet, rich in saturated fat and animal products, but don't eat carbohydrates, and you could eat as much as you want, so, the eggs and bacon for breakfast and a T-bone steak with salad for lunch and a half a roast chicken with salad or green vegetables for dinner, and you smother it in butter and oil, and all the things we were supposed to not do. And if you tell someone to do that, not only do they lose weight, but their heart disease risk factors improve. And all 5 studies showed the same thing, and they were from clinical trials up and down the East Coast, basically. And it suggested, this is the joke, it suggested that everything we know about, or everything we're being told about diet and health was wrong. Because, the Atkins diet, again, was a ketogenic diet. That's why Atkins was crucified for promoting it. He got very wealthy, but the medical establishment didn't appreciate him promoting a radical idea like ketosis. So anyway, I wrote that article. I argued that maybe dietary fat wasn't the problem, maybe carbs were, and I've been following that ever since. And I actually didn't want to call my book The Case for Keto because I didn't want to distract from the major points. That was sort of originally the book was called How to Think About How to Eat. And then our mutual friend, Mark Bittman, came out with a book called How to Eat 6 weeks before mine was originally scheduled to be published. Theirs came out in mid-March of 2020, so they got swallowed up by COVID. And mine was not scheduled until late April, so we could delay it. And when we delayed it, we changed the title to so they wouldn't compete. And it became The Case for Keto. Well, I didn't fight it because I've basically been making the case for ketogenic diet since that original 2002 article.
It's a pretty profound idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to put all this in context. And the context is, if carbohydrates are fattening, those of us who get fat easily can't eat them. And then the extreme version of carb restriction is a ketogenic diet. But for 90 years, people have been insisting we get fat because we eat too much. And, you and I and others have been arguing you get fat because of the carbohydrate content of the diet. And some of us just, if we want to reverse that process, we basically have to restrict or abstain from them entirely. And then you replace the calories with fat. Now you're doing a keto diet and you're fatted.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing that you would have been told 195 years ago.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean,
so
this has been around for a while. In fact, our good friend David Ludwig, who's a Harvard professor, who's a clinical trialist in obesity and insulin resistance. He says we don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because we're fat. And what he means by that is that when you start eating carbohydrates, you get hungry fat growing in your abdomen. And it's not just fat there holding up your pants. It's actually hungry fat that makes you hungry and eat more carbohydrates. So it's a vicious cycle. And it causes fat storage, slows your metabolism, increases hunger, and locks the fat in the fat cells. It's literally a one-way turnstile. Once the fat gets in, which comes from the sugar, is turned into fat, it can't get out. So it's kind of a disaster. And he said something to me once, which just blew my mind and made it all make sense to me. He says, remember your training about type 1 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics, an autoimmune disease where the pancreas is damaged and you cannot make insulin. These people have, we call it polydipsia, polyphagia, and polyuria, right? So they're constantly thirsty because they're peeing out all the sugar and salt and everything, but they're hungry. They're starving all the time, which is polyphagia. And that means that they can eat 10 or 20,000 calories a day and they will not gain a pound. In fact, they will lose weight. So why is that? It's because they have no insulin, and you need insulin to gain weight. And the whole key to keto is that it shuts off that insulin. And so, one of the whole issues here is this whole calorie myth, which you dissected in your book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. Can you take us down a little bit of why we're still so stuck on this? Why? In fact, David Ludwig sent me a paper from the American, I think, Endocrinological Society that was relatively recent by a whole panel of experts on obesity, very renowned people. And they all came down and said, it's all about the calories. And I was like, I thought we were over that one. So
it's not just all about the calories, because they're willing to accept that counting calories doesn't really help anyone anymore. It's this idea that it's all about energy balance.
Right.
So what David Ludwig is saying, the idea is, you have the different foods have different effects on our hormonal status, and whether or not we accumulate fat is determined primarily by hormones, insulin and glucagon. So insulin is the dominant one, and glucagon is a sort of a counter hormone. So if some foods stimulate insulin, carbohydrate-rich foods and protein to a lesser extent, carbohydrates only stimulate insulin, protein stimulates glucagon, which works against insulin, the fat tissue. So it's sort of, the argument is obesity is a hormonal thing. You cause your fat cells to accumulate excess fat, and that in turn steals calories from the rest of your body that you would use for fuel, and so you're constantly hungry. Yeah. And when insulin's elevated, the only calories you could burn for fuel are carbohydrates, so you're constantly hungry. So that's part of the vicious cycle. Back at the turn of the 20th century, when nutritionists and doctors first started thinking about what the cause of obesity is, it's funny in science, and my interest even more than nutrition is how science progresses and scientific thinking. And in science, the tools you have available determine what you can learn, right? So in physics, you get a bigger accelerator, you can learn more about the universe. In astronomy, you get telescopes that look in different wavelengths. You could learn different things about the universe, whatever you could see in that wavelength. And in nutrition, the only tool they had that seemed relevant to obesity was a device called a calorimeter, which could measure the energy expended by a human being, or could measure the energy contained in a food that the human ate. So they created this theory that obesity is caused by energy in being more than energy out. It seemed intuitively obvious because that's all they could measure. They couldn't measure.
It's a math problem. I mean, weight loss is a math problem. It's basically
weight loss is a math problem. So, and there are other people arguing, look, it's clearly a hormonal issue. It's like you look at men and women fat differently. That's hormones. Like boys go through puberty, they gain muscle and lose fat. That's hormones. Girls go through puberty, they gain fat in specific places. That's hormones. It's all hormones, and it's just some people, they're going to get fat no matter how much they eat. Or the only way they're going to stop themselves from getting fat if they starve themselves.
Yeah.
And this was the German and Austrian clinicians who were doing the best medical science in the world at the time argued this. And it didn't matter. An American came along, a guy named Louis Newberg, University of Michigan, and claimed he had done the first experiment ever. This was 1930. And in this experiment, he proved once and for all it was all about calories. It's about how much you ate. And it was always about how much you ate. And no matter what the excuse, like, women, when they go through menopause, they gain fat. Now, animals, when they go through menopause, if you remove the ovaries from animals, they'll gain fat. And that was well known even in the 1920s. So it seemed to be a hormonal thing related to estrogen. But with women, it was about eating too much. They sat down with their lady friends and played bridge and ate bonbon. I mean, incredibly sexist explanations for why it's never hormones. And it caught on. It caught on in part because World War II came along and the German and Austrian researchers arguing the opposite vanished. They evaporated with the war.
So the Germans were the ones pushing that it's not energy balance. And because they were German and Nazis, we got rid of that theory.
We got rid of that. And it sounds like we're joking, but it's nowadays, I mean, it's very easy to demonstrate in the history. It's people cited Newberg. They didn't cite the German. Actually, the prime guy was an Austrian. He was a Jew named Julius Bauer. He fled to the U.S. in 1938, but the only job he could end up getting was he was one of the founders of the sort of endocrinology research in Europe. Very well known, pioneer in the field. Flees the Nazis in 1938 when they attack. They move into Austria. He ends up going to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He works at LSU for a year, and then he goes to L.A. and gets a job at the Hospital of Medical Evangelists. And he publishes papers like Julius Bauer, Hollywood, California, and nobody pays attention.
Yeah.
He's not at Harvard. He's not at Yale. He's not at Columbia. He's like, who is? But
we've had decades of other research since then. I mean, there's been really well-designed, well-executed clinical trials by David Ludwig and others looking at this whole hypothesis of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis of weight loss, which is a hormonal one, and what it really leads to in our thinking. And this is sort of striking to me. Researching some of my books, I discovered that if you're a kid and you're overweight, it's more of a stigma than if you're a kid and you're in a wheelchair and a quadriplegic. And we basically blame the person who's overweight for being fat. It's your fault you're fat. Just eat less and exercise more. And otherwise, if you don't, it's just because you're lazy and a glutton. And that fat shaming and that underlying approach is based on this idea of the calorie myth and that weight loss is just a matter of willpower. So why is willpower not the issue here?
Well, again, it's based on this energy balance idea. If the obese child, maybe he's 40 pounds overweight at age 12, that means his fat, he's been storing 50 extra calories of fat a year in his fat cells. So why can't they fix that? Why can't they just eat a little less, store a little less, or exercise a little more, store a little less? And it's the answer that lean people come to is, well, they must not care enough. If it's about energy balance, and I make this point in the case for keto, if it's about energy balance, that absolutely, that creates the concept of fat shaming in effect. Because the assumption is always, if it's about intake and expenditure, then you should be able to take in a little bit less or expend a little bit more. It doesn't take a world of effort. We're talking about tiny numbers every day. So why can't people do it? And then you end up assuming it's because they don't want to.
Yeah.
Or they don't have willpower you come up with. And it's interesting, by the 1960s, obesity research in the U.S. was dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to figure out how to get those fat people to eat less. I mean, they didn't care. The idea that they just have a fat storage disorder. We have a fat storage disorder. Just like if you saw somebody walking down the street who was 8 feet tall, you wouldn't think about how much they eat and exercise. You would think he's got some kind of growth hormone dysfunction.
Right.
Even if you weighed 400 pounds, which often if somebody's 8 feet tall, they're likely to weigh 300 or 400 pounds. You don't care about how much they're eating and exercising. You care about the growth hormone issue and growth hormone receptor. But here, they just didn't think like that. And once they didn't, and this is the danger in any sort of medical scientific process, once you assume something to be true based on an assumption, then it's going to infiltrate everything you do, and it's going to affect everything you do. So David Ludwig does these terrific, very well-designed experiments to suss out whether or not obesity is a carbohydrate insulin problem or a calorie problem.
Yes.
And for the most part, his work has sided with his own preferred hypothesis, carbohydrate insulin. But there are other people who think the opposite, who claim that their experiments are just as well designed. And then you end up getting
nameless.
Yeah, they will remain. And the problem is, all we can do, like you as a physician and me as a journalist, is say, look, this worked. Well,
I'm a practicing doctor, and I'm just humbled by seeing real patients in real time and not just looking at theory or scientific articles or textbooks, but actually seeing what works and what doesn't work, depending on the person. And this is really an important piece here. And you say in your introduction to your book, you say, I'm not writing this book for the lean and healthy of the world. I'm writing it for those who fatten all too easily. And I think that's the key line in the book. There are some people who can eat whatever they want and they're fine because they're highly insulin sensitive. But when you look back, for example, at the Native Americans in this country, there was no obesity, there was no diabetes, there was no heart disease. And now, second to Samoans, they're the fattest population in the world. Why? Because their diet changed from what they were adapted to a extremely high carbohydrate diet. They were great at starvation. They were magnificent at managing scarcity, which hundreds of genes do that.
But I don't think the Native Americans dealt with a lot of scarcity in this country.
Well, I mean, they might have had to deal with some scarcity. And hunter-gatherers, they could get food, but there was food, but it was tough, right? It wasn't like
it wasn't that tough. They, when Lewis and Clark, when Lewis and Clark, crossed the country in 1805. They had to push the buffalo out of the way on the Great Plains. Literally, you've got these herds of millions of buffaloes.
But they had to. But historically, we've gone through periods where, it wasn't always easy to go to the grocery store and get food. So we are really well adapted to starvation. And then there's a whole class of people that really this book is for. The Case for Keto, Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating. Everybody should get a copy. You go into explaining why there's a subset of people, which turns out to be probably the majority of people in America.
Probably the majority.
Right? There's 75% are overweight. 88% are metabolically unhealthy. So maybe there's 1 out of 10 that's a lean, healthy person, and they got lucky. But for the rest of us, carbohydrates make a difference. So what does it mean to fatten easily? And why is this book so important for people who are overweight to really understand, and read?
Well, and this is, we get it. If you're one of these people who struggles with their weight, the conventional wisdom, the assumption, the advice we get from everyone when it's a calorie problem and you got to eat less and exercise more, the idea is if you're still struggling with your weight, you're not trying hard enough. Whereas the rest of us want to say, look, I tried that. I did eat less, exercise more. I spent the decade of the 1990s hungry. Okay. I gained weight anyway. This is what it means to, it's like, I restricted my calories. I ate in moderation. Michael Pollan and I tried my best to eat not too much, and I got fat anyway. So we're different from the lean people. So a lean person comes along and they think, okay, I eat in moderation. This is my issue with David Katz, and I hope David Katz someday reads the, Yale affiliated doctor who has become a major spokesman for the sort of mostly plant movement. And the world is full of these, healthy, lean, buff physical trainers and marathoners. And they think, I eat in moderation, I'm lean, I eat in moderation, and I exercise. Therefore, if everyone else ate in moderation, exercise, they would be lean too, which is not true. And if they don't eat in moderation and exercise, or if they're not lean, it means they're not eating in moderation and they're not exercising enough. So I have to tell them, eat in moderation, don't eat too much, eat a healthy diet, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And the point is, we all did that.
Yeah.
We're not the obese and overweight. The 88% of Americans who are metabolically unhealthy are not sitting in lines at McDonald's right now in their oversized, SUVs with the specially wide seats, waiting to get, their triple cheeseburgers and super sized fries and huge Cokes. I mean, some of them are, but some of them are eating very healthy and doing their best to eat in moderation. They're still overweight because they're getting the wrong advice. And that's what I'm trying to communicate. We've been getting lean person's diet advice for the past century. This is what I eat. Therefore, this is what you should eat. What I'm arguing is that those of us who fatten easily, if we eat what they eat, we're going to be either fat or hungry. Those are our two choices. Mm-hmm. And possibly both.
Yeah, that's both. Right. That's
and
right.
That's
as a practicing doctor, I see this in real time by looking at people's hormones and their metabolism and their insulin levels and their lipids and their inflammation. I can tell often just by looking at somebody, because I've had so much experience, but just looking at their lab test, which type of metabolism they have. And the truth is, and I often feel bad and I apologize to my patients because I say, listen, I didn't design this. I'm not the creator of your biology. I'm just the interpreter. But I'm telling you, if you really want to stay healthy and avert all the diseases of aging, because they're all connected to this mechanism of high insulin, right? Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, depression. I mean, I could go on and on. If you don't pay attention to this, you are going to be in trouble. And the truth is, like you were saying, what do these lean people have in common? They're insulin sensitive. I don't know if you know Jorge Plutsky. He's a cardiologist at Harvard, a preventive cardiologist. He said, Mark, if you were to take a group of 100-year-old people who had absolutely clean arteries, they'd have one thing in common. I said, what's that? He said, they'd be insulin sensitive, meaning they are very good at producing very low levels of insulin that are extremely effective in the body, that don't require them to produce more and more to get the same benefit. And sort of like that's what insulin resistance is. It's essentially when your cells become resistant to the effects of insulin, so you produce more and more and more and more to keep your blood sugar normal. But eventually, that burns out and you get diabetes. But even before you get diabetes, it just causes the weight to pile on and all the metabolic issues.
Yeah, and this is, those people who, I mean, you could guess if you've got a weight problem. This is right, though, the first symptom a doctor is supposed to look for to diagnose metabolic syndrome, which is we could call insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia syndrome. And the first symptom you're supposed to look for is your waist size is increasing. You're getting fatter. And then it's high blood pressure and low HDL cholesterol and high triglycerides and glucose intolerant. You're becoming diabetic. All those things are happening. And the way you fix it is remove the cause of it. The cause is first, the highly refined grains and sugars. But then for many of us, and this is where you start going into sort of keto diet land, for many of us, it's all carbs.
Yeah.
All carb-rich foods other than green leafy vegetables,
fruit,
grains, beans, starches. Yeah, it's because our bodies can't tolerate it. And this is just not the message we get. And it's a strange time we live in, because often I feel like, we were making a lot of progress getting the nutrition community to pay attention, but now we live in the age of fake news. So it's easy to write off alternative perspectives as fake news. And I wander around thinking, wait, am I a purveyor?
Are you a fake news purveyor?
Am I a fake news? Because I disagree with the establishment. But again, the argument we're making and what you're telling your patients, what I'm telling readers is, look, try this. The one thing we know for sure, right, is low carb diets are safe and benign. When I first wrote that New York Times Magazine article 18 years ago, the assumption was that 19 years ago, the assumption was these diets would kill you, right? I mean, I had tried Atkins as an experiment. I described sitting in my diner in New York, having my morning eggs and bacon and waiting for my heart to blow up, because that was, it's high in saturated fat. Christ, it's high in bacon. I should have died of colon cancer decades ago. Knock on wood. We know they're safe now. We know they're benign.
Yeah.
That we
That's
know
true.
for sure. Now people can try them without being afraid. that they're going to somehow blow up their hearts, and they can see the benefits.
Yeah. And I think that what happens is that in medicine, we tend to be lumpers, not splitters. We lump everybody into one group, saying, all you humans are the same. You're all metabolically identical. You all need to follow this same monotonous advice, and you'll all be fine. And it's absolute nonsense, because as we're learning, there's a large heterogeneity or variation of the population according to their genes, their metabolic issues, their family histories, and so forth, and their need for different types of diets and foods. There's no one size fits all diet. So for me and for you, maybe we are, relatively lean guys, and maybe it's just because we follow this advice. But
my case, it's because I follow this advice, right or wrong. I may be killing myself, but
I've gained 15 pounds by eating more carbohydrates. I went through that period, and I'm now down. And I think that but this isn't, keto isn't, I think, universally effective for everybody, because I think some people, and I've seen this in my practice, if you're wanting to, for example, optimize your health and people are trying keto as a health kick, and you're one of those people, for example, like me, who when you eat excess fat, it actually can screw up your metabolism in the sense that it can cause really worse lipid profiles and all sorts of abnormalities that you wouldn't necessarily see. So I think there's still a lot to learn about who's the right person for this. And I think we'll be able to sort of discern this through both hormonal metabolic testing, but also genetic testing.
Yeah. And I agree with you. The question would be, though, if you've got a patient, obese diabetic patient, someone who struggled with their weight their whole life.
There's no doubt.
We're going to agree that we have to get their insulin down.
Yes,
right?
100%. 100%.
Fundamental. And so then the question is, how do you do that in a way that maximizes their benefits, and in a way that they can maintain it for the rest of their lives? And those are sort of different questions. So for the most part, we talk about it in every, because even though, again, this book is called The Case for Keto, but the book is about the subtitle. It's rethinking weight control and the science practice of low carb, high fat eating. And throughout the book, I use the term low carb, high fat / keto or ketogenic eating. I admit that there's nothing catchy about it. Nobody's going to say I'm doing Talbs LCHF / keto. But I'm trying to be inclusive. At some level, I'm just trying and hammering on this. And people say, well, Talbs keeps writing, the same thing over and over again. It's because we have to get more and more people to accept that this is a carbohydrate problem. Yeah. It's not a fat problem. It's not a, it's funny, even what you just said. So my next book is on diabetes, and specifically diabetes. And I'm obsessed with the history. And I'm going to apologize.
Well, wasn't that the case for sugar? That was sort of talking a lot about.
Well, that was also diabetes. That was diabetes on a population-wide basis. This is sort of on a individual. What's the dietary treatment of diabetes? How we got into this world where the ADA is prescribing high carb diets.
Well, it used to be. I mean, the treatment for diabetes used to be, back in the 1920s, a 70 to 75% fat diet and very, very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. That was the treatment before we developed insulin.
No, that was from the 1780s till 1914.
This is Harvard's Joslin Diabetes Center. This is not some radical.
Yeah, no, I know. So that's the. Anyway, the point is, once you restrict carbs, then you've got, and you still have problems, and people start talking about, what else should I restrict? Do I have to restrict fat also? Do I have to, and we're saying on some level, how do you fix these people? Everyone's going to be different. Lipid profiles, I'm a little less sanguine about what we really know about the connection between lipid profiles and long-term health. There's so much confusion there and so few diet-related clinical trials that would actually tell you once you've sort of fixed your metabolic syndrome, once you've lowered insulin and got your weight under control, what do the other lipid markers mean? Because we decide, based on people who eat a standard American diet, that's how we decide what these, the association between these risk factors and disease are. But you're not advocating a standard American diet to your patient, and I'm not advocating it. So once you fix your obesity and your blood sugar levels issues with carb restriction of some form, from, moderate to severe, from, improving the quality of the carbs might be enough for people.
Yeah.
But even then, it's sort of, everyone's different. Everyone's going to be able to tolerate a different level of carbohydrates. But on some level, that's...
What you're saying is so important, Gary. I just want to stop there, because I think what I've learned is that there's a continuum, right? There are some people who, can't even look at a bagel, because if they do, they'll have a cephalic insulin phase response, meaning they'll think about the bagel, it'll make their insulin go up, and they'll gain weight without even doing anything. That's the one extreme. And those people, I would say, they're like celiac disease. They really need to be considering themselves carbohydrate intolerant. And then there's the continuum of people who are sort of somewhere along that spectrum. And the question is, what is right? And do you need to be full keto? Can you just be lower starch and sugar, more higher fat without being keto? Because keto is a very specific type of metabolic framework. And I think maybe we should take a little time to dissect what happens when you eat keto, and what the benefits and / potential risks are, and particularly how keto can be monitored in a way that makes sure you're doing it. So tell us about what is actually keto, and how do you know you're keto, and how do you do that?
Yeah, and again, remember, despite the title of my book, which is The Case for Keto, it's not actually about keto. It's about, so keto to me is the extreme of carbohydrate restriction, where you replace the carbs with fat. It's and Atkins was keto. It's hard, the way I refer to it is like back when I was young, that's what we called a ketogenic diet, was Atkins. And Atkins got in trouble because he was advocating a ketogenic diet. So we can talk about, there are different definitions for how much carbohydrates people can tolerate without, in order to get into ketosis. But one of these things I did in this book is I interviewed 120 odd physicians from around the world who had converted to our way of thinking. And I wanted to know what they were trying to communicate to their patients and what the challenges were. And, it was surprisingly, I don't think there was a single one of them that actually had the patients check for ketones. They just wanted to get their patients off carbs. It's like, if I can get them off carbs, if I can get them to accept that dietary fat is benign, that it's not going to kill them, then we're going to be fine. And that's what they're going to eat. As soon as you start thinking of it as a specific diet, I am doing keto. And I've had people say to me, well, I don't know if I'm doing keto because I don't have a bulletproof coffee more than twice a week. And then the Ted Naiman's got a new book out called the I think PE diet, which probably protein energy ratio. And does Ted think of his diet as a keto diet because he's advocating for higher protein and lower fat? And I'm saying, on some profound level, again, individual variation is going to play a huge role, but we don't know the answers to what the level of protein should be to maximize this. And there's probably not one level of protein for any, because everyone's a little bit different. Some people are going to run into trouble because they can't tolerate the amount of fat they're eating. Some people are going to run into trouble because they can't tolerate the amount of protein they're eating. Some people are going to do fine and never have measurable ketone levels. And some people may be in a brain fog because they don't have measurable ketone levels. Right. I've discussed this endlessly with Steve Finney, who's done as much work on ketosis as any human alive. And, Steve thinks if you're not Steve's the guy to really talk to about, what's the phrase, well-formulated ketogenic diet. If you're cutting carbs, but you're not cutting them enough, and you're not eating enough, and your ketone synthesis isn't high enough, then you'll never feel good. You'll never have energy. He talks about it like an island you have to hit in the ocean. And that could be true, but most people don't think so. I think most people benefit from these diets without ever measuring ketones. They just...
Yeah, I think that's right. I've as a physician learned to sort of pick the right person, right? I think, food is medicine, right? So if food is medicine, then what is the right medicine for each person within food, right? And I think it's different. And I wish we could all say we're all the same, but there's tremendous variation in the population. We're learning more and more about personalized nutrition, precision nutrition, personalized medicine. That's what I do. That's what functional medicine is. And it's very humbling when you sort of start having these grand theories. Everybody should be vegan. Everybody should be keto. Everybody should be blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute,
Yeah, but remember, we're still saying if you struggle with your weight and you struggle with your blood sugar, you got to cut back. Everybody who does that should cut back on carbs.
Well, here's the thing. Yeah, I agree. Here's the thing. Everybody is going to get in trouble when they eat sugar and starch, whether you gain weight or not, because it creates metabolic changes that might not make you fat, but make you sick. And that is important to remember.
We've all had that type of patient who is really doing everything right and not seeing the progress that they want. And so this really inspired me to dig deeper into what does the research say about what other factors might be involved in improving our metabolism, our weight, our overall health, our longevity that aren't just the main ones we talk about, which are food, sleep, stress management, and exercise. And there are really 3 additional factors that seem to really have strong research backing that impact metabolic health in a big way that you're probably not going to hear about from your doctor. And these 3 are: 1, how much exposure we're getting to sunlight and at what times of the day we're getting it. The second one is the amount and types of metabolism disrupting environmental chemicals we're exposed to. And these now have a special name of this category of metabolism disrupting chemicals called obesogens, because they actually promote obesity. And the third, and this one does relate to food, but is a little bit more specific, is the levels of specific micronutrients in the body that we know are critical for metabolic processes to run properly in our cells. So we often sort of stop the conversation at food around macronutrients, how much protein, fat, carbohydrates are in our food, but really shifting the conversation towards specific micronutrients, these vitamins, minerals, cofactors, antioxidants in our food, is another level of the dietary conversation that I think often gets missed. So those are really 3 that I think are strong that can accelerate or enhance that journey of weight loss, of metabolism optimization, of improving insulin resistance for many people who are feeling stuck.
Yeah, and I would. Can I add a few more?
Please, yes.
Because I thought about this a lot. In fact, Casey, in my first book on metabolism, Ultra Metabolism, in 2005, one of the chapters was "Love Your Liver."
Yes,
and it was really about the role of toxins and the load of toxins causing obesity in ways that really had not really imagined before. And the data since I wrote that book in 2005 has just been overwhelming about its effect on all sorts of things from insulin resistance. So BPA, for example, which is what you get on credit card receipts, it's in plastic bottles, cans, that causes insulin resistance. And that's just one example. So there's a whole slew of those things. But there's more. For example, the microbiome turns out plays a huge role in our metabolism, independent of what we eat. And they've done studies on mice and animal little rats or whatever they do the studies on. And they found that just swapping out, for example, a poop from a thin mouse to an overweight mouse causes that mouse to lose weight, independent of their dietary intake. So the microbiome is huge. Also hormones, and a lot of things go on around hormones, thyroid hormones, sex hormones, obviously insulin, which is hugely involved in diet, but that can be involved in many other things that are independent of diet. And also food sensitivities, I think, are one that people don't often realize, that anything that causes inflammation independent of calories can cause a problem. So if you're eating something you think is healthy, but actually your body's creating an immune response, that's going to create inflammation, and that's going to cause insulin resistance. And then there's also other phenomena that might happen, like mitochondrial disorders that are more uncommon, or other factors. So I've looked at so many different things over the years that are driving resistance to weight loss. And usually if you're a good detective and you kind of drill down, you can really get to the bottom of it for most people. And it's, and the obesogen thing is really true. I had a patient who was this trainer. She was like a fitness trainer, super healthy, ate great, and she just could not lose weight. And we did a deep dive and we found out she had really high levels of mercury. We got rid of the mercury and she dropped 40 pounds like that it was pretty amazing. So it's super powerful.
Absolutely. And I think you really get at a key point here, which is that there are so many factors that are involved in what's happening with our metabolism, our cell biology. And you really need to dig deep and ask those questions and have time with the patient, or the patient needs to have this baseline understanding to even go down that road of identifying what is going on and what are the potential barriers to actually having the health that we want. And this is where, of course, functional medicine absolutely shines, because we tend to have a little bit more time with the patients and actually are going down all of these different pathways that actually lead to the reality of our cellular physiology in the body. And so I think from that perspective, from these, at this point, I think we probably named 10 things that are related to insulin sensitivity and metabolism. And, really it comes down to being a detective, like you said, and figuring out in your life, in your body, which are the factors that are at play, what are the barriers to improving them, and how do we do it? And so I think knowing these things can really help just a sense of hopefulness, because there's probably several avenues that any person has not dug into before they're kind of at the end of the road in terms of getting their health on track.
For sure. So Casey, let's dig into the toxins. And first, I want to talk about how much we learned in medical school about this, right? With zero. Okay. Like we learned about acute poisoning, but we never learned about honestly, the three things that we really need to know about our health, like our microbiome, toxins, and food, we know nothing about in medical school. So it's insane. But these are the areas that have the most leverage in getting people healthy. So, in terms of, the framework around obesogens, what are the ones we should be most worried about when it comes to metabolism? And then we'll get into how we diagnose problems with that, and actually how the mechanism of these toxins influences our metabolism.
Yes. So like you said, obesogens are toxins, and obesogens, as you can tell from the name, it has to do with fat and obesity. And so the real landmark thing that's kind of happened recently is we've realized that obesogens are specific metabolism disrupting chemicals in the environment that it directly increase fat mass. So this is not a correlation. This is causation. And there was this great paper that came out earlier this year. It was 49 pages. It was a tome. And Dr. Rob Lustig was one of the authors. And it was called Obesity 2. And it was all about obesogens. And it concluded that these chemicals we now know directly increase fat mass through about a dozen different mechanisms. Yeah. And it is thought that potentially 15% of obesity is directly attributable to these chemical exposures. Wow. So where are they from? They are basically all around us. They are in the air we breathe. They are in the food we eat. They are on the food we eat. They are in our cosmetics and our personal care products, our home care products. They're in our furniture, our electronics, papers. They are all over the place. And actually, a few come from natural origins like lead and cadmium, and you mentioned mercury, but most are industrially manufactured chemicals that are largely unregulated. And so some of the specific examples of where you can find these. So
mercury is natural, but it doesn't mean it's healthy, right? Lead and mercury are natural,
exactly.
But they're healthy.
And there is that handful of natural obesogens like the mercury and the cadmium and the lead that can increase fat mass, but you want to be conscious of how much of this you're consuming. But the vast majority of these are coming out of factories, coming out of companies that have huge lobbying power and that are putting these in everything. And so this is things like can linings, thermal papers, printer toner, vinyl floorings. They are in basically all plastics, even if the plastic is BPA free. They're found in our personal care products, especially shampoos, conditioners, lotions, deodorant, sunscreens, makeups, food preservatives, food colorings. They're actually in drugs. Antidepressants have been known to have obesogenic properties. They're in car exhaust, so it gets in our air. Paint that goes on our walls, our clothing. They're in flame retardants on children's toys, on mattresses, on couches. A lot of different home care products like disinfectants. And then, of course, one that is on everything, which is agricultural pesticides. So all of these things that I just mentioned have been shown to have mechanistic properties that increase fat, basically the printing of fat in our bodies. So this is kind of fascinating. And the mechanisms are, it's not just one thing. They really all work together synergistically to cause metabolic problems. And some of the big ones touch on one you were talking about earlier today, which is microbiome. So these chemicals can directly impact our microbiome, the diversity and function of the microbiome. These chemicals can alter the hormonal control of eating behavior. So actually affecting our satiety hormones and our hunger hormones. They affect thyroid function, which is directly linked to metabolism. They impact sirtuin genes, which are, of course, as Dr. Sinclair has popularized, these are very important for our longevity. They change the folding of our genome. So actually our epigenetics and the way genes are expressed, they can directly cause gene mutations. They cause inflammation. And then they can really affect our hormone receptors. So this is a big one. They can either be activators of hormone receptors or blockers of hormone receptors. And of course, hormones are so critical. This nuanced balance of our health and our day-to-day functioning. And these chemicals can literally go in and block or activate those receptors. One frightening thing I'll just mention is that they not only affect all these things in our bodies, but they also do it to our sex cells. So our germ cells, like our sperm and eggs, which means that the impact of these chemicals that are all over our environment can affect our offspring through germ cell, which is essentially our sperm or eggs, epigenetics, and DNA. So we really need to all be familiar with the term obesogen, understand where they come from, and understand how to advocate both for ourselves and on a systems level to minimize the exposure that we're getting to these in our environment.
Yeah,
and many
huge.
of them last for generations. So yeah.
Like you were saying, yeah, I mean, just thinking about how, for example, leptin is, you get leptin resistance with increased environmental toxins. You get, which makes you feel like you're hungry all the time. And you get effects on your mitochondria, which affects your metabolism and how fast your metabolism works. So there's so many different mechanisms that are underlying this. And I think we're now beginning to understand this. And we also see how they trigger inflammation. So any toxins, they're also immunotoxins. So they increase this process of making more inflammatory cytokines through this mechanism called NF-kappa B. And you get high levels of these cytokines like TNF alpha, interleukin 6. It's so central to everything. So this sort of inflammation from any cause will cause weight gain and obesity. And then here's the problem. It's even worse when people start to lose weight. Guess where all the toxins are stored? They're stored in our fat tissue. So when you start to liberate fat tissue, you start to liberate more toxins. And actually, there's a phenomenon of resistance to weight loss as you're losing weight. You're going to actually stop losing weight because the toxins interfere with the very process of weight loss. So they affect your thyroid function and many other things. So it's a little bit of a mess. So you have to really help people detoxify properly and learn how to get their systems working. And that's kind of what's so great about functional medicine. And I wrote an article. I don't know when it was. God, it was probably forever ago. It was called Systems Biology, Toxins, Obesity, and Functional Medicine. And it was, I think, in the probably early 2000s. And it was really just looking back then at the data that we had on this. And now, like you said, there's so much more data. And we're so exposed to toxins, and they're really pretty much everywhere. So it's a little discouraging for people because, like, what do you do? How do you start to think about this? So you have these toxins. So people listening are going, okay, well, gosh, we live in a sea of toxins. This is pretty depressing. If I eat straw, I'm still gonna gain weight. So what do I do? What do I do? Like, how do we avoid them? How do we get them out? What do we do to help address this sort of phenomena of obesogens in our environment?
This is the key question. And I think it's a battle that's going to be fought on many different axes. And I say battle because it really is an uphill battle against industry that uses these chemicals and wants them in a lot of different things. And, of course, aren't necessarily top priority is not necessarily our health. So I think there's really four main axes that we're going to need to approach this on. And one is on the systems level. One is on the individual choice level. So we can, of course, advocate through our vote and our dollar about what happens at the systems level. But then, of course, day to day, we also just have to choose like what we're putting in, on, and around our body. Then the other two axes really is focusing on personal avoidance, but also improving biologic resilience. So how do we actually build a body that processes these chemicals effectively, detoxifies them, gets them out, and is healthy enough at baseline that we can manage this additional stress, which unfortunately is almost inevitable. So I think just briefly touching on that systems level, which, you have written about in such detail, and Food Fix gets into this a lot. And so I'll just, very, very briefly touch on this one. I think it's a crazy statistic, but our rate of global chemical production is increasing at a rate of almost 4% a year and will probably double by 2030. And since just the year 2000, deaths from just ambient air pollution linked to fossil fuels and chemical pollution has risen by almost 70%. And very little regulation has come from this. We have a law that's meant to protect us, which is called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which came out in the 1970s, but has really been poorly implemented. And we see things happening all the time where strong science comes out, like recently the EPA put forward a proposal to get rid of a chemical called trichloroethylene, which is used in dry cleaning and removing grease from different things like clothing or car parts or bikes or things like that. And the proposal to ban this was strongly supported by science and was just completely basically rejected and withdrawn because of strong complaints and lobbying from the chemical industry. So so the systems level, we can think about using our dollar and advocating for legislation that helps, but really it comes down to, acutely what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So there's definitely some easy practical tips that we can do to kind of help ourselves. I think the first one is eat real, clean, sustainably grown food. This is the basic building block of the body for improving biologic resilience. And if you're eating whole foods that are grown in a clean, sustainable way, you're getting a lot of the way there. It means that you're getting the micronutrients that are going to help your body process these chemicals. It means that you're getting the different plant chemicals that are going to upregulate our antioxidant defenses and our anti-inflammatory pathways. It means that we're going to be avoiding pesticide exposure, which is an obesogen. It means that we're not buying things that come in plastic. So just by eating, fresh, whole, clean, sustainably grown food, you're hitting a lot of the different boxes with the obesogen problem. Within whole foods, there are some that are extra special. So of course, cruciferous vegetables, which are going to have the sulforaphane that activates our antioxidant defense system. So this is the cauliflower, broccoli, kale, bok choy, cabbage, sauerkraut, these things that are directly going to change gene expression to protect us from some of these obesogenic chemicals. Then, of course, it's like what's your food stored in. So we want to avoid plastic storage as much as we can and really try and opt for glass and other materials. And now it's so easy to find this stuff. You can go on Amazon, you get glass Tupperware, glass water bottles, aluminum or ceramic, things like this. And again, it's not just about BPA. I think that's a little bit of we often now look for BPA-free plastics, but plastics contain as many as 15 endocrine disrupting chemicals. So BPA is just one, and it's great that it doesn't have that, but there's other things like BPF and BPS and these other chemicals that we know are endocrine disruptors. So be the weirdo who brings, the bamboo fork and knife in your purse to the takeout restaurant. Be the person who always has the glass water bottle and who brings your own storage containers, because these things actually do add up and make a difference. The next category that is really important. Be the weirdo. I mean, give these things as gifts. I have a running Google Doc of gift ideas, and a lot of them are becoming basically these types of things, like give people the portable, reusable wood cutlery, and things like this that they might not think about, but that can really help their health. I am someone who loves personal care products. I love cosmetics and, all this stuff. And so this one has been really important to me, figuring out how to basically reduce the toxins and toxic load of all these products I'm using. And so I think this is really low hanging fruit. So basically look at your bathroom, look at your shampoos, conditioners, lotions, makeup, deodorant, toothpaste, and probably throw out most of what's in there and look for the brands that have very few ingredients, that are ingredients that you recognize and know, and that are approved ideally by the Environmental Working Group website, which has basically a registry of all personal care products. And you can just walk through the store and search things on your phone and find out what is least likely to be toxic. So I've really moved away from a lot of the complex products to things like, for moisturizer, like you can use organic coconut oil or jojoba oil. You can use cast iron soap like Dr. Bronner's. For dish soap, for hand soap, for body soap. You can use vinegar and water for disinfecting sprays for your countertops. Like, it's actually, once you get on this train, it's quite easy.
It's not that
and
hard.
There's so many great brands these days. It's not that hard.
Yeah, it's super important. And then of course you need to give your body the things to detoxify, right?
Right. And actually supplements can be helpful in that regard. Whole food, of course, is the foundation, but supplements like vitamin C, curcumin, probiotics, resveratrol, vitamin E, these have all been shown to have basically resilience boosting effects on our ability to process toxic chemicals. And I think the last one I would mention, I mean, we could go on and on forever about how to avoid these, but I think another important one is air filtration, because air pollution is such an under-recognized contributor of chronic disease. And so getting a really high quality air filtration system actually has been studied and has been shown to have a clinical effect on mitigating the effects of toxic air pollution. So really personal care products, whole foods, making sure you're including cruciferous vegetables and anti-inflammatory foods, avoiding plastics, and getting your air under control, and maybe supplementing with some high yield supplements. Those are definitely some of the things that we can do that are pretty simple to avoid the impact, the mega impact of these chemicals.
Yeah, so you don't be too depressed, because there's a lot of things you can do to reduce your exposures, to upregulate your own detox pathways. Things like saunas are great, very good for detoxing chemicals, making sure you're eating a lot of fiber, which helps you eliminate the chemicals. And sometimes you need a more aggressive detox protocol with the doctor, but it can be a very effective strategy for people to help them lose weight. So let's sort of jump to the next topic, because the toxins are a bit depressing.
They are, yeah.
But I just before we jump off of that topic, I saw a report recently which sort of shocked me. It was, we know about 11 million people die every year from eating bad food, not enough of the good foods, which I think is probably an underestimate. But there's about 9 million people that die every year from the environmental toxins in the environment. So it's a huge cause of global deaths, which makes it really high up there. I mean, there's about 70 million, I think, deaths every year, but about, I think, 9 million are from toxins. And those are something we just don't know anything about from a perspective of traditional medicine. But thank God functional medicine provides a way for you to assess and treat those problems. So it is a real problem. We should definitely all be focused on it, and we can shift the market by changing what we buy and what we purchase and what the demand is. So that'll also help. So Casey, let's talk about the next topic, which is micronutrients. And I think it might be surprising for people to think that vitamins and minerals and micronutrients play a role in resistance to weight loss. How's that so?
So this is one of my favorite topics in health. I think in part because I don't think I learned about the idea that these micronutrients are so useful for health until way after medical school. It was really in my functional medicine training that I even, got, you probably remember this, but there was this whole dogma in medical school that vitamins and minerals just make expensive urine. And of course, now we realize wait a minute, what are these actually doing? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so I just said quick on that,
Casey. I hate to interrupt, but I always say on that theory, then we shouldn't drink water, because we just drink water and then we pee. So we shouldn't just drink water, because it just creates a lot of excess discharge we don't need. It's just a dumb argument.
It's so, and especially when you really actually just turn on your brain and think about the biology of this. And so it's I think just breaking down briefly, what do these micronutrients do? It makes it so obvious that line of thinking just doesn't work. And so big picture, like our bodies are energy factories. We have around 37 trillion human cells in our body. Every single one has energy factories, mitochondria, to basically create the energy we need to run and to function properly. And within each of those 37 trillion cells, there's probably in many of those cells, thousands or more of mitochondria. So the numbers are gigantic. And every single one of those mitochondria need vitamins and minerals as cofactors to allow their cellular machinery to work. And so micronutrients are this category of small molecules that we get mostly from food that are involved in these innumerable metabolic processes, and they're totally necessary for glucose regulation and ATP production. And these include things like vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and some that you've probably heard of are, of course, vitamin C, D, E, B vitamins, magnesium, selenium, chromium. There's many, many more. And they really function in three main ways. So the three ways that micronutrients function are, first, they can actually be structurally incorporated into proteins to make them work properly. So an example of this is selenium. And we have this whole class of super important proteins in the body called selenoproteins. And these are critical for our immune function. And for that protein to literally be built in the cell, because all of these proteins are basically put together like Lego sets, you need that micronutrient selenium to be a part of it. And these are super important and protective antioxidant proteins, and again, really involved in immune cell function. And many, many people are deficient in selenium. And so that's one way that micronutrients function, is actually being a structural part of proteins. The second way that micronutrients function is to be a cofactor for cellular processes. And so this is like, an example of this would be if you are trying to convert something in the cell, like from A to B, and it requires a protein to do that chemical reaction. That protein might need a little lock and key cofactor to basically activate it, like a key in an ignition. And that is where a vitamin or a mineral can actually bind, create this tiny, tiny molecular shift in that protein that basically gets it to work properly to do that chemical reaction that might be critical for some step in a cellular signaling process. So the second reason micronutrients are important is because they act as these lock and key cofactors to get these cellular reactions to work properly. And then the third way that these micronutrients act is that they can directly act as antioxidants. So they not only can be a part of building proteins that become antioxidants, but they themselves can do it. And your audience is probably very familiar at this point with what antioxidants are, but really, like, briefly, we make all these metabolic byproducts in all of our chemical reactions in our cells every day. And when there's an excess of these, they can be damaging, they can build up, and they can hurt our mitochondria, they can hurt our DNA, other cell structures. So antioxidants actually bind to these reactive molecules and neutralize them, so these reactive molecules don't go around damaging things in the cells. And things like vitamin E and vitamin A, they actually have the chemical structure to bind that reactive unpaired electron on one of these reactive molecules and essentially turn it into a neutral species. And literally sometimes if they have, an oxygen and a hydrogen, these antioxidants, they can bind with an electron and turn it into water. And so it's truly neutralizing damaging things in your cell. And one fun thing I learned, in my functional medicine training was that a common feature of these antioxidant molecules is that they have this hydrocarbon ring that basically has space for unpaired electrons. And so it's taking the load of this reactivity in the cell and taking them out of commission. So there's really three, very clearly understandable ways in which these micronutrients are so critical for our cells to function properly. And since we get them from largely food, and when we don't have enough, we can get them from supplements, we can see why it's so important to really be eating a nutrient-dense diet to load our body with as many micronutrients as possible.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, there's so many ways in which these nutrients work. They're not just a unifunctional substance like a drug, which essentially you take and it has one mechanism of action on one receptor and it's very limited. These are multifunctional compounds which act across all sorts of pathways in our body. And just, I just want to sort of highlight a couple of key things that I think complement what you're saying, which are around how, for example, nutrients affect metabolism. And your blood sugar and your thyroid are critical in terms of regulating your weight, metabolism, and your overall health. And magnesium is of critical importance in regulating blood sugar. In case your company is all based on regulating blood sugar levels, Health, which is quite an amazing company for measuring continuous glucose monitoring, which helps you see what's going on. But magnesium is so critical, but so is biotin and chromium and B vitamins and a host of nutrients that we often are very insufficient or deficient in. And then thyroid is another one. It's really important. For example, selenium, you mentioned selenium. That's important to convert the inactive to the active thyroid hormone. And if you don't convert it enough, you can't get enough T3, and so your metabolism is sluggish. Or let's say you're low in vitamin D, which is about 80% of Americans, or lower, insufficient, or deficient. Vitamin D is needed for the thyroid to actually work on the nuclear receptor to actually affect the gene expression that turns on your metabolism and all the other beneficial thyroid effects. So if you're low in vitamin D and you're low in selenium, if you're low in iodine, for example, another trace mineral, it's really important for producing thyroid function, thyroid hormone. So there's so many ways that all this is connected, and we really don't pay attention much to this in medicine, but it's critical to have the optimal levels of these nutrients so everything can work properly.
That's exactly right. And following up on two things you just said, I think magnesium, which so many people are deficient in, it has like 300, magnesium is involved, I believe, in over 300 chemical reactions in the cell. And one that we never learn about is that for ATP to be biologically active in the body, it actually has to be bound to magnesium. And there's a little pocket on ATP that binds magnesium. And so,
what's ATP for those listening who don't know what that is?
ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So this is sort of the end result of that those mitochondrial energy producing processes that give us this currency of energy that we can use to run all our cellular processes in the body. So ATP is just so critical. It's what our body spends to basically do work, and we've got to make it effectively. And to do that, we have to protect our mitochondria, which means being insulin sensitive, reducing cortisol, inflammation, oxidative stress, and really focusing on protecting our cells with all these resilience boosting factors that we find in whole, nutrient dense, clean foods. So magnesium is a critical one, of course, has a huge impact on neurologic function as well. And another point you touched on, which I think is so critical, is that over half of Americans are now deficient in at least one critical micronutrient.
Yeah, I think it's 90%, Casey, actually, according to the NHANES data.
So way over half then.
And by the way, that's at the minimum level to prevent deficiency disease.
Right.
So how much vitamin C do you need to not get scurvy? Not very much. Right.
Right. And we now know that the functional need that we have for a lot of these vitamins is actually much, much higher than what is recommended to just avoid deficiency. And one interesting thing about micronutrients is that it's dynamic in our bodies. There are different days and different weeks and years that we might need different amounts of these vitamins based on what the stressors and what is being asked of our body. So for instance, if you are particularly stressed or sleep deprived and are really burning through your stress hormones, you may have a higher functional need for B vitamins that week or year to basically continue producing these things. So the idea that we need 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day, like that's kind of a crude way of looking at it. It can actually be very, very dynamic. And for people who may be generating more oxidative stress and need more antioxidant capacity in the body, maybe they need much more vitamin C. So I think that's another really important point, is that these things are dynamic. And unfortunately, some of them are kind of difficult to test for right now. So I think really understanding, hopefully through podcasts like this and others, that, getting at least the baseline understanding of like, okay, I need a lot of micronutrients in my body. And when I'm going to the grocery store, I'm not there to buy bread and tortillas and chips. I'm on a micronutrient hunt. I am there to find as many micronutrients as possible. And I think at baseline, a really good thing for everyone to do to take ownership over some of this is to learn what the maybe 10 to 20 really important micronutrients are for key metabolic processes and where you can get some of those things. And, and so that can at least help you shop, to get those things in your kitchen. Yeah.
I love this. So you and I sort of were trained in this. We go in the store, we know, right? And it's like almost like, what is it? That Iron Man guy, he's got that kind of head goggle with the computer, and you can see that like monitoring everything. So I kind of walk in, and it's like I have this superimposition on all the food of what's in it, what the phytochemicals are, what the nutrients are. But maybe we just, for fun, let's just go through the nutrients and start talking about where they are. Like, let's just start with the vitamin A, and we'll go through the list. A, B's, we'll go through the whole thing, and some minerals, and quickly kind of go through where people can find these things. So I'm going to start with vitamin A. Vitamin A, the best source, by the way, is liver. And I was just at the farmer's market, and I bought some pasture-raised chicken livers, and I had that for dinner with onions. It was super cheap, super delicious. That's for sure the best source. But there's also other sources. For example, a lot of the carotenoids get converted into vitamin A in the body. So sweet potatoes, carrots, even green vegetables have a lot of vitamin A in them.
I love that.
How about the B vitamins? Let's go through some of the B vitamins. What's a great source of B vitamins?
We have there are so many B vitamins, and we basically want to get all of them in good levels. And so, B vitamins, you can get them from meat, from tuna, from asparagus, from Brussels sprouts, chickpeas, lots and lots of different sources. Do you have any favorite B vitamin sources that you go for?
I kind of, the organ meat thing is gross for people, but if you actually look at like the most nutrient dense source of B vitamins, it's liver. It really is liver.
Yeah.
No people want to eat that. So, but it also is all in the greens, and a lot of animal foods have a lot of the B vitamins, B12 particularly, eggs for sure, and also it's found in beans and in grains, and so they're all over the place. So, but B vitamins are relatively easy to get, although we do get a little low in folate because we don't eat enough greens, and if you're a vegan, you tend to be low in B12. So those are those.
And nutritional yeast is one. I mean, it's fortified with vitamin B12, and so that is one place for vegans to get some B12 that I use a lot of.
So let's do C and D then next. We'll just go in alphabetical order.
Yes.
Where can we get vitamin C?
So vitamin C, I mean,
not just orange juice, because that's not what you want to do for your blood sugar,
absolutely not orange juice. No, I think my favorite place to get vitamin C is bell peppers. So red peppers, orange peppers, yellow peppers. You can, of course, get it from oranges and citrus fruits, carrots as well. But those are some of my favorites, and certainly not from juice, because you're going to get a huge dose of sugar along with that vitamin C. And then for vitamin D, you can get it from fish, so salmon, trout, and then mushrooms, but herring. Only mushrooms that are grown in UV light. So if you're at the farmer's market, a lot of mushrooms now are grown indoors. And so you want to ask the farmer, like, were these grown outside or were these grown in UV light? And then, of course, the best place to get vitamin D is just exposing your skin to sunlight outside. And so getting that UV light during the day, and not being quite as photophobic as we are these days.
Yeah, for sure. And porcini mushrooms are a great source too of vitamin D. They're harder to get, and I love going to Italy because I can get those fresh porcini mushrooms, but they're really the highest mushroom in vitamin D. Yeah. And E, obviously we can get from grains and beans. Grains have a lot of them. They germ, and the whole grain foods have a lot of vitamin E. How about some of the minerals? Let's talk about some of the minerals like magnesium and
magnesium.
Iodine.
Is one of my favorites. So my favorite source of magnesium is pumpkin seeds. It is the highest amount of magnesium. I think there's 156 milligrams per 1 ounce serving of magnesium. So that's like what you would get in a supplementation you'd buy in the store.
And zinc too. It's one of the really high sources of zinc.
Great source of zinc, which is so important for our immune function. So pumpkin seeds, at least getting an ounce or so per day. I often make pumpkin seed milk in the Vitamix. I will pulse pumpkin seeds and dates in the food processor to make a crumble on top of yogurt. It's really easy to get it in. You can
I love them toasted on my salad.
Yeah, toasted on your salad. The other great source of magnesium is actually chia seeds, which have over 100 milligrams per 1 ounce serving, of course, coming along with a ton of omega-3s and fiber. So chia seeds are great. You can also get a lot of magnesium from very dark chocolate, from spinach. almonds are an amazing source, cashews, black beans, kidney beans, tofu, and some animal products as well, like salmon. Avocado is a great source of magnesium. So it's pretty easy to get it if you're thinking about it, but I especially try and backload magnesium-rich foods at the end of the day, since magnesium can be really good for relaxation and kind of getting ready for bed.
The connections between the food environments that we live in and the behaviors that lead to obesity, diabetes, and chronic disease, and particularly in communities that are affected far more than others, communities of color, minorities, the underserved, the poor. This is just striking to me how this actually is so deliberate.
Yeah, so I'm a family doctor. I treat children and adults, and the patients that I see predominantly are obese and suffer from diet-related chronic diseases. And it's frustrating as a physician, as a provider, treating patients one-on-one, talking yourself blue in the face, giving the same advice over and over, and then seeing patients really struggle and not being able to succeed.
Which is what doctors get told to do. Eat less, exercise more, come back in 3 months, and if you're not better, I'll give you medication.
Yeah.
That just doesn't work.
Well, that doesn't work. And part of the reason it doesn't work, especially in the communities where I work, is that there are such environmental obstacles or contextual barriers to people doing the things that they would otherwise want to do, be motivated to do, and just are challenged in getting done. I routinely counsel patients on diet and nutrition and making good, healthy choices and optimizing their eating. And then they go out into a world where that, becomes a real difficulty for them. So during residency, I remember we did this community survey where we went out and just kind of looked at the neighborhoods and saw where our patients were living and tried to understand, try to see life through their eyes. Mm-hmm. And
you actually went out into the community,
yeah,
people's homes and their environments, and actually got out of the clinic,
homes
and
the
office.
environments, but also into the stores and into the retail environment.
Mm-hmm.
And having an interest in nutrition, one of the things that I wanted to focus on was food sources. And so we went into community grocery stores, and it was there that I took a picture that I still use in presentations to this day. It's this this improvised wooden bin of kind of moldy onions and old potatoes, and that was the produce section.
Yeah,
of a supermarket. It's called supermarket.
Old, ugly, rotten produce, right?
Terrible, right? And that was right next to shelf after shelf of highly processed, refined, sugar added, salty, unhealthful snacks that
and addictive and colorful,
and enticing and all those things, right?
Heavily marketed,
just kind of an overwhelming incentive or an overwhelming impetus to eat poorly or to do, to not have the best diet.
It was hard to make the right choice, easy to make the wrong choice.
That's exactly right. I mean, the default was the default was to not do the healthy thing.
So embedded a little bit in what you're talking about is the idea, I think that's pretty strongly held by most nutritionists, doctors, certainly policymakers, and certainly the food industry, which is that it's all about personal responsibility, that your choices are your own, and that if you make bad choices, it's because it's a moral failing or you're weak or there's some issue with you that guides your choices. And if you just were serious about your health, you would just eat less and exercise more and everything would be fine. What's wrong with that idea?
I think that's absolutely preposterous. I mean, I in my patients, I'm struck by how motivated people are, how much they want to get better, how much effort they put into doing the thing that will help them be healthier, and yet being stifled in every at every turn by an environment that's just not supportive of those efforts. And so it's really, it's really not a matter of will or willpower or determination. I mean, my patients have, buckets of all, and yet are still, find themselves in situations where it's just hard for them to succeed, and they're in an environment that's set up to, to help them fail, really.
Yeah. So the reason is because the environment that people are in is sort of a toxic nutritional landscape. It's a wasteland. where you could say get moldy onions and limp rotten broccoli as opposed to some other stuff which is cheaper and easier to get and more heavily promoted. And you write about something that's quite interesting in your research that I think people aren't aware of, which is not only the obvious stuff, which is heavy food marketing by food industry, not only having all the junk food in all the convenience stores and even grocery stores, and not only just the fast food stores, but something you call OSB. Now, that is sort of an interesting concept, which is something that actually drives a lot of behavior that people don't know about, and I really wasn't really aware of as a driver of a lot of the bad choices. Can you talk about what is OSB and why does it matter, and how can we affect it?
So OSB is actually just an acronym that the journal came up with. So our first paper about this. So it stands for Other Storefront Businesses. But it just gets to the point that there is a lot of unexpected food sources out there. So when people think about the food environment or food deserts or food swamps or these toxic, landscapes of food, everyone's talking about either the paucity of grocery stores or, full service supermarkets or the overabundance of fast food outlets. But there are so many more sources of food out there than just food stores and restaurants. And to that point,
Like you mentioned, barbershops, gyms, hardware
stores. Food is available everywhere.
Laundromats.
I was in Staples the other day, right? You
Yeah.
can get food at Staples, Home Depot,
candy and Staples
everywhere. Candy, cookies, snacks, potato chips, sugar sweetened beverages of every color and variety.
So it's like flashing neon lights,
everywhere.
buy this, and it's impulse buying, and people don't actually
Impulse
think
buying,
about it. And
yeah.
it's all in places where there naturally are, but not normally a place where you would get food.
Well, normally a place where you wouldn't think you would get food, but increasingly it's everywhere. And so another study that we did, so not only just demonstrating the prevalence and how kind of ubiquitous it was, but the fact that it's becoming even more prevalent, even more ubiquitous.
So what percent of overall food consumption are these OSBs for people who live in these urban or food
we can't
desert
comment
or
on consumption.
environments?
We don't even know purchasing at this point, but we can tell you, the proportion of food sources that they represent. So they're as numerous as restaurants at this point.
So the volume of food available in those is as much as restaurants?
So more numerous than
more
supermarkets, more numerous than grocery stores, more numerous than food stores, and as numerous as restaurants currently. And that's been increasing. So we looked over a 5-year period, and there was food available in 30% more businesses 5 years after an initial look than there was when we looked, kind of a baseline.
So it's accelerating. And they're not selling hummus and nuts at the checkout counter, right?
Generally not. Although I have to say, a third of all these kind of non-intuitive other storefront businesses offer food currently. That represents about a quarter of all the healthful options out there and about 2/3 of all the unhealthful options.
Meaning what's available in those is mostly unhealthy.
Disproportionately unhealthy. Although, occasionally you will find, so people will sell nuts, they'll sell dried fruit, they'll sell, whole grain crackers, they'll sell things that are, less detrimental to good eating and the kind of things that we want patients to choose, people to choose to be healthier.
Yeah.
But those are overwhelmed generally by the sodas and the candy and the chips and the cookies and the the other things that we really don't want them eating.
Yeah.
And so it's a big issue. And it's one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention and that, people have kind of glossed over, and that, it gets lost in the whole discussion about, food deserts and food swamps and, if a neighborhood has access to food or if they don't, like no one's really considering these things.
And so how does that stuff get there?
Well, how does it get there? I think it gets there because it sells, right? So
the food industry is deliberately creating another channel of distribution.
Yes.
Sort of under the radar.
Yes.
That is hugely impactful and provides the volume far greater than we estimated.
We have every reason to believe that it is. And, what my research has demonstrated, and, some of this is published already and some of it is in press or under production, but it's showing that the greatest, the food is more prominent, more prevalent, available in more places, in more challenged neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that are more disadvantaged, that suffer from diet and diet-related diseases. And so it's interesting that it's not, uniformly available across the board. it tends to be more available in the communities that need it the least.
So it's pretty amazing. You're not just sort of living in your ivory tower, writing about this stuff. You're literally working in the Bronx, in underserved neighborhoods with the poor and minorities, seeing this stuff every single day, living and working in that environment.
Yeah.
So you've written a lot about how do we start to change these toxic food environments? What are the levers that we can pull? What are the strategies that we can use to help shift that? Because at the end of the day, it's the food system and the food environment that is the bigger determinant by far of health, obesity, diabetes, chronic disease than personal choice and responsibility. That's really clear. I think it's not certainly the consensus, but I think if you look at the data, there's no question about it. So what are the kinds of things that you've talked about? 'Cause it's not just, you're not just sort of criticizing this. You're talking about how do we change the food environment? What can we do creatively to actually make a difference? And how do we build on those things and scale them?
So I think there are a lot of levers at a lot of different levels. Certainly for physicians, for health systems, I think there's a lot we can do. Or I think there's a lot more we can do. And there's been some glimmers of hope and things that people have done already. So for instance, in our clinic, we've experimented with a bunch of initiatives to help address the issue of food access in communities and try to improve that. One thing is a fruit and vegetable prescription program. So not initiated by us, but something that we tried and glommed onto. So this is a strategy whereby, patients come into the office, they are suffering from obesity or diet-related diseases, have a need for better food in their environment, and we write them a prescription just as we would for a medication or a device or any other.
Like 6 nuts 3 times a day.
Well, we write them a prescription that says you should be eating more fruits and vegetables, or generally, some amount of fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And then that serves not only as written advice from a physician, from a doctor, from a trusted source to do the good thing, but it also served as a coupon to then take to a local store to subsidize the purchase of those healthy foods.
So how's the mechanism of payment there? So the doctor writes a prescription. Gives
doctor
the
writes a
patient.
prescription.
Does insurance pay for the groceries?
The insurance does not pay for the groceries. So this was grant money, right? And so
it's basically philanthropy
and seed money. Well, it is, and then so the idea is to get it started.
Yeah,
and then it's working with the local stores, the corner stores, so that and grocery stores, and in some cases we also used farmers markets to make the supply of healthful food more available, right? So it works on kind of 2 levels. So it's not only increasing demand by, giving direct advice for patients to eat more, but it's also working on the supply side by, working with owners to say, you should stock this. We're going to be sending patients to you. This is going to create demand and opportunity. And ultimately what it does is it gets both consumer and the businesses into the habit of exchange of healthy food, and it becomes more the norm, right? And it becomes something where this corner store is offering fruits and vegetables. We're sending patients there. Patients are shopping at that corner store now. The corner store that's not participating sees that they're losing business, or that there's a competitive advantage to offering fruits and vegetables, and they come onto the scene, right? And so there could be this extension or this ripple effect out in the community that makes the food environment healthier overall.
So it pushes people to buy healthier food and businesses to stock healthier food.
It does both of those things. Yeah. So it works on both. And I think any strategy is going to have to work on both the supply and the demand.
Well, there's one other piece of that, which is I work in Cleveland and again with poor communities, and you say somebody eat an avocado, they don't know what it is.
Right.
They never bought one. Or have some kale, they don't know what it is, how to make it. How do you deal with the problem of the lack of awareness of even what to do with these foods?
Excellent point.
Because it's one thing to say eat this, and then they go, well, I didn't hear it.
So I did some work early during fellowship with the Food Trust in Philadelphia, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the idea that everyone should have access to healthful food. And there they did some corner store work that worked both on the supply and demand side. So on the on the supply side, they worked with corner store owners to stock, fruits and vegetables and, in forms that were appealing to kids. So like cut up fruit salads, maybe with, some shelf talkers or some advertising that made it look appealing. And then,
Tony the Tiger for fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, or something. Right. Well, exactly. Right. You need some branding or some icon or a logo.
Called Super Sprouts, which had, Colby carrot and
yeah.
Brian broccoli,
well, it's
all
exactly
the superhero vegetables.
And I think one of the aspects of their marketing or advertising was actually coming up with a comic book to go along with it. So to kind of get kids.
Get your superpowers.
Yeah, make it cool. Make it something appealing to kids. So that's on the demands on the supply side. On the demand side, they went into the schools and did tastings with kids, demonstrations with kids. So a lot of these kids are growing up in families that generationally have lost cooking skills, that have, moved to, processed and convenience items that are, opening dinner from a box as opposed to, making it from scratch. And so a lot of these kids had never tasted a pepper. They'd never tasted a strawberry. They'd never tasted, different kinds of fruits and vegetables. And when they're given to them in fun shapes and novel ways and different mechanisms, kids actually like them.
They like them, yeah.
And, so you can introduce the kids, get their taste buds excited and then send them to the store where they see the item that they just had. And, and again, it kind of sets up a loop. And so, this takes grant money or seed money or, some type of initiative to get things running. But once, if you can find that magic point where you get it started, it creates a positive cycle that reinforces. And it's good for communities. The store owners have some reticence, right? I mean, they're they don't necessarily all jump onto the opportunity, but some realize a real business opportunity, a real opportunity to improve their communities. Many of the corner store owners or small store owners are from the communities that they're working in. And so they have a vested interest in, making their communities healthier. And so, those are...
finding the little tweaks that can help people stimulate different behaviors, right?
Absolutely little tweaks. And I think the more the better, right? Yeah. So like the food industry spends, impossible amounts of money promoting, marketing, making available
billions
stuff. The stuff that we just do not want patients eating are the things that are making patients sick, quite frankly. Yeah. I mean, they're selling sickness.
Yeah.
And to counter that, we need as many strategies as possible.
I mean, think about it. We spend, I think the data changed, but anywhere $10 and $13 billion spent on just advertising and marketing poor quality food. And the worse the food is, the more marketing and advertising they devote to it. And it drives behavior, and the average kid sees 6,000 to 10,000 ads for processed junk food on TV and media. And probably now, it's hard to measure, but through social media and stealth advertising, it's probably even more. It's more surreptitious. Even before, they used to say, here's a picture of a baby in the 50s drinking 7-Up and Coca-Cola and how good it is to get them to drink their formula. That's obvious and terrible. Nobody would go for that. Now it's all subliminal. It's celebrities. It's kind of, friend marketing. And it seems like it's authentic and natural, but it's not. And it's deliberate. And it's one of the drivers of so much of the behavior. It's a problem.
Yeah, well, and to your point about surreptitious advertising, and I should come back later to some other strategies that we're using in the clinic to help counter that. But we did a study in the Bronx actually looking at subway advertising. So this is something that no one had really looked at before. I mean, people have done
this
studies.
Is shocking. Everybody listen in, because this is shocking.
Well, so I mean, people have done studies looking at TV advertising and advertising on computer games and advert games and video, and all kinds of screen media. But there hadn't been a lot looking at the environment where, patients, or particularly children, are living, are playing, are going to school, are commuting back and forth. So we decided, wouldn't it be interesting to go and see what was being promoted in the subway system and the subway stations. And so we rode every subway line in the Bronx, got off at every station, and looked at every ad.
Wow.
And characterized it. And so, it's like 68 stations on like 7 lines, and there were like 1,500 ads. And we, did a content analysis and measured their sizes. And particularly, we're looking for promotion of unhealthy foods and beverages. Yeah. What we found was that there was
ad for broccoli all over.
So there was
grass-fed meat,
zero ads, not a single ad for a healthful food product.
Nothing,
not a single one.
Eat almonds, nothing.
Nothing. However, ads for unhealthful food products, So alcohol, sugar sweetened beverages, sugary cereals, processed foods, fast foods were disproportionately found in stations that were in neighborhoods, home to communities that were challenged by, various demographic and diet related issues.
More diabetes, more obesity,
more diabetes,
poverty,
more hypertension, more hypercholesterolemia, high cholesterol.
These are poor minorities. These
Poor
are
and then also
more
more poverty, lower education, more children in the neighborhoods, more foreign born, more immigrants, right? So adds disproportionately to that. So we looked and we said, well, maybe it's just a function of the fact that these are just the biggest stations, right? So like Yankee Stadium's a big outlier. It's a huge number of ads in Yankee Stadium. So we said maybe it's just a function of foot traffic, right? So, advertisers are just, selling to the
eyeballs.
biggest possible
many
audiences.
Eyeballs, right?
Yeah, many eyeballs as possible, right? So they're just, putting their money where, where they can reach the most eyeballs. And it just so happens that those are in these neighborhoods. Well, it turns out exactly the opposite. So it turns out that those unhealthful ads were not related proportionately to the amount of foot traffic or the number of eyeballs. The inverse was true. So it wasn't that they were trying to reach the biggest audiences. They were trying to reach select audiences. And the select audiences that they seemed to be trying to reach were those who were most challenged, right? So poor, minority, foreign-born children living in poverty.
So this is important for people to just pause and understand what this is about. So basically, these are areas where the worst affected by obesity, disease, poverty, where the minorities live, people who have lack of education and are the most burdened. Yet by volume of people, the number of eyeballs, it wasn't the greatest. It was just the ones that were at most risk. Now, why is that happening? Because it's much easier for the food industry to sell people who are already eating poorly more bad food than have you or I start to drinking Coca-Cola or eating processed food or having junk. So they target existing communities to create what they call heavy users. Michael Moss talked about in his book, Salt, Sugar, and Fat. This is a deliberate strategy by the food industry. Now, when you say, well, they're not bad actors or just have legacy products, they have unintended consequences, they're trying to shift their product formulation. Okay, they are. Maybe they are. But they're also employing these nefarious tactics, which are targeting the most at risk and the ones who have the least amount of ability to stand up and have a voice for what's going on, the least ability to understand it, and also the most affected. I mean, this is, in my view, criminal.
I agree 100%. And I think it's awful. And I think, the silver lining that came out of that research was that it happened to be published at a time when there was a huge campaign and a lot of effort and interest in getting alcohol ads out of the subway system, out of mass transit. And what we were able to document was that among the unhealthy food products or food and beverage products that we looked at, we were able to subtract out alcohol and saw that the same relationships held, right? So the same disproportionate advertising, the same targeted marketing. Mm-hmm. And so that was compelling evidence to then bring to the MTA, who runs the subway, to say, this is just unspeakable, right? And it moved people. I mean, it was one rare case where evidence can influence policy, and that's unusual and rare in this day and age, but it wound up, a unanimous vote to take alcohol ads out of mass transit vehicles and properties. Yeah. So across the whole system. So that was a win. However, as with any, public health win or initiative, you have to worry about unintended consequences. So I was really happy about that, children are no longer going to be, children, minorities, the poor, uneducated, or lesser educated rather, are not going to be exposed to alcohol ads on their daily commutes or as they go around the city, go to and from their homes. What you have to worry about is what fills that space, right?
Do you think we should be banning unhealthful advertising and marketing?
Well, my concern is that now that the alcohol advertising is gone, what's going to come in are ads for Coca-Cola and M&Ms and other unhealthful products that appeal to children more directly and that they're direct consumers of. Do I think we should ban it? So I'm always cautious about bans. So I think, bans are well intended, but as I said, as with any public health campaign, but particularly with bans, there are unintended consequences. Yeah. So you have to really think like what if you ban the unhealthy, food products, for instance, what comes in to fill that space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. There's an initiative in Chile, which you probably heard around, which is a sweeping set of reforms we've chatted about on the podcast before. And I talked to Barry Popkin, who was one of the architects of the reforms in Mexico and Chile around food policy, because they're so disproportionately affected by the obesity and diabetes epidemic. And what he said was they got a bit of funding to look at the impact of the change of these policies. And one of the policies was eliminating any character cartoons from kids marketing or any products, right? So cereal boxes can't have superheroes or anybody else on there. They eliminated any advertising in movies, print, radio, TV, I think even online for kids between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. And that they even put in an 18% soda tax, but what was more impactful than all the other policies was eliminating the marketing, like fourfold bigger impact, which was shocking to me, and spoke to the fact that we have to find a way to deal with this. We are one of the only westernized or civilized countries or developed countries that allow unrestricted food marketing to kids. Now, you can say, what's the First Amendment, right? We have right to free speech. Corporations are people, according to the Citizens United. Yeah. They should be able to sort of say whatever they want to say. And yet we do regulate things around children differently. And I think when it comes to children, and particularly given that 40% of kids are overweight now, that if a kid's a teenager who's obese or overweight, their life expectancy is 13 years less than someone who's not at that age. Yeah. These are really serious issues. And so I think, we have to figure out, how do we get the political will to do this? How do we get the data to show this impact? And some of the other countries are innovating around this. So if you were, in charge.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely true. And it's exciting work that's, come out of those other countries. In this country, I think we've focused on tobacco and alcohol, which I think everyone can agree are kind of unambiguously, not good for kids to be exposed to, or early introduction to, or initiation with. It gets a little tricky in the food landscape because it becomes a question of, well, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, and how do you define that? And I actually think marketing for healthy foods could be a beneficial thing.
Yeah,
I mean, as you mentioned earlier, put a cartoon character on some
broccoli.
broccoli.
They don't eliminate marketing for food, just the unhealthy stuff.
Well,
and then but then it becomes
how do you define unhealthy? And then
I don't know. I think you and I could probably agree on how to.
Well, we probably
unhealthy.
could come up with some definitions, but and this is what the pushback from the sugar sweetened beverage industry, and one of the tricky nuances and caveats as it's been tried in different municipalities, right? So, certainly sugared sodas, right? But do diet sodas fall under that, umbrella?
Philadelphia thinks so.
Do juices, do juice drinks, do flavored waters?
Yes.
Right? So it becomes a sticky issue.
Well, I just got back from Abu Dhabi, and it's an interesting, it's a benevolent leadership there, which is fairly autocratic. They can make very easy, quick decisions, and they're not beholden to the food industry because there's no taxation in the country. They get no revenue from the food industry. They really don't have investments in the food industry. There's no way for them to influence policy. And they have this massive obesity and diabetes epidemic. And they put in 100% tax on energy drinks and a 50% tax on soda. And one of the products was Red Bull that was impacted. And I think the finance minister from Austria, he said, where I think Red Bull's from or something, called the guy who was sort of in the government and said, hey, what's going on? We're seeing a 70% reduction in consumption of this.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to lay off all these people. It's like, well, we made the policy. We're sorry. That's how it's going. And the pushback from the food industry is quite strong.
Well, and no doubt it would be. I mean, it cuts directly into their profits.
And this is, by the way, this is a government official calling another government official saying your policies are hurting our companies, which is, not in the public health's interest.
Right. Well, so even with the success that's been seen with some of these measures, a lot of that success has been narrowly conceptualized or focused just on food. And I think, particularly with advertising, as I mentioned before, if advertising for food is eliminated, something else comes in to fill that space. And if that something else is not good for health either, I mean, let's just say, in this country, we don't have tobacco advertising, but let's just say, you eliminate food advertising and not tobacco advertising comes in, or e-cigarette advertising comes in, or advertising for, misogynistic movies or, or things that, right, like that impact people's health in other realms other than, food or what they consume, that's not necessarily a net benefit for public health. And so I think that all has to be considered. And likewise with the sugar, if Red Bull sales go down or sugar sweetened beverage sales go down, maybe that's a good thing, but does that so maybe people aren't spending their money on their sugar sweetened beverages anymore. Now they're buying cookies and cakes and sweets instead and drinking, is that necessarily the win? Is that a better,
well, I think they're looking at overall health. They're looking at obesity.
I think you have to look at overall health. And I think that's one of the problems with past research and one of the, one of the things where I think research and policy and awareness needs to move into the future is that you can't narrowly look at single ingredients or single foods or even diet in isolation from broader lifestyle and broader health. I think you have to look at the whole picture and see what the ultimate impact is on people, on communities, on quality of life.
Totally. So you talk a lot about food as medicine and when food isn't medicine. And you really highlight the lack of nutrition education in medical school that's been talked about. And you're a doctor in a healthcare system, and yet it's clear that the solutions aren't necessarily in the doctor's office. And you've really done a lot of work on looking at what are the approaches that a health system can take to own the health of their populations and communities through better health and nutrition practices. So what are the kinds of initiatives that you've explored that could be fixes to the food disaster that's in the communities that you see?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you said, and as I mentioned, it's frustrating in clinic to engage with patients one-on-one and face all these obstacles. And so I think, the real solutions come from getting outside of the literal boxes of doctors' offices and clinics and hospitals and out into the community and making it so that the environment better supports people's motivations to be healthy, right? And their intent to do the right thing and to help them. And so, as I said, we've done some work in our clinic. I mentioned the fruit and vegetable prescription program. I mentioned some of the work that the Food Trust has done. We've also done things like, directly try to impact food access. So we've partnered with a farmer's market that comes to our clinic during the farmer's market season.
So you go to the doctor's office, you can go to the farmer's market at the same time.
And you can get you get a voucher, right? You get a, written advice from the doctor, a little financial subsidy, and the, fresh fruits and vegetables in a peeling form, are, freshly picked and available to you. And we've also done, things like cooking demonstrations and tastings to help patients understand what to do with these products. A lot of them are foreign. A lot of the products are foreign to patients, right? They haven't seen them before. They haven't tasted them before. They don't know what to do with them, how to prepare them, if they'll even like them. And to shell out money for that is a big gamble and risk and not necessarily someone's going to take unless you can demonstrate to them, this is what you do, and this is how easy it is, and this is what it tastes like.
And they want to know.
And they want to know. Oh, they absolutely want to know.
We did a cooking class at Cleveland Clinic in one of the hospitals. 300 people showed up. Yeah. And we demonstrated how to make smoothies and different healthy foods, and they were just so engaged. And these were not, sophisticated, people who were shopping at Whole Foods. They were people who just wanted to get better health, who were often disadvantaged. Yeah.
And I think that's crucially important. Other things that we've done are things like helping bodegas redesign. So going out into the community, into the stores around our clinic and, speaking with owners, trying to incentivize them to stock healthy foods. The fruit and vegetable prescription program.
So you walk into the bodega with your white coat and you say, hey.
You might even go in as a group of white coats and say, hey, I'm a doctor in the community. I care about the community. You're working in the community. You come from the community. Is there something we can do to help incentivize you to store healthier products, or where can we make some movement?
What do they say? Nobody's going to buy it. They're not going to.
Sometimes they do, so you see what you can negotiate and see what you can experiment with, and sometimes it happens just by patient demand. If I tell patients that if you're going to be choosing bread, you want to choose like a whole grain bread or a sprouted bread, and they go to their store and they tell me all they have is white bread. Well, then that starts a conversation with the owner, and the patient says, my doctor tells me I should have whole wheat bread. Would you carry whole wheat bread?
Yeah, it just astounds me that, white bread, particularly bread, is just as bad as sugar, if not worse.
Yeah.
And they still put high fructose corn syrup in the bread. I don't understand. And like 5 other kinds of sweeteners.
Well, I mean, so talking about solutions outside of
cake bread.
Yeah, no, it is dessert bread. And I think, that gets to a bigger issue. So before I mentioned there are many levers on many levels, and that gets to a bigger level of, our food production system and our subsidies and, how we do crop management in this country and what we focus our interests on. I mean, the amount of interest, effort, and resources that go into producing corn and soybeans and, other commodity crops that get then highly processed and injected into virtually everything is astronomical. And if we better, aligned our systems with healthy food production, I think it'd be better overall.
So Farm Bill revisions.
Well, Farm Bill revision, but so it'd be better for us as consumers, and then there's also arguments better for us as a planet, right? So we are our health is also related to the health of the planet, and when we don't respect the earth, I mean this just happens to be where we live, and we don't have a lot of options to go elsewhere. So
I mean people don't realize that eating processed food made from corn, wheat, and soy is actually a huge contributor to climate change. People think, if you eat meat, it's going to be the problem. But no, the way we grow these commodity crops destroys the soil, depletes the water supplies. The carbon can't be held in the soil.
Produces the forests.
Clear cutting to raise more of these crops. And so we're destroying the rainforest of the prairies, which is the soil, which actually probably has a bigger capacity to hold carbon. And when people don't realize that. So you think, I'm eating, soy, corn, and wheat. I'm a plant-based diet, and yet you might be just as big a contributor to climate change if you're not aware of how the food is grown.
Yeah, although I will say that those corn and soy products, I mean, a lot of those are used to feed our animals too, right?
That's the other problem.
I mean, so the animal agriculture,
it's like double.
Animal agriculture doesn't get a pass here.
No, it's a double whammy.
It's
a total double whammy.
But I mean, that's part of the animal production system, and part of our factory farming, highly commercial industrial processing, right? So we've kind of gotten away from everything has become big ag, big production.
So what about small ag? You talk about some of the initiatives you're doing with community gardens.
Community garden, yeah. So we had a community garden at our
health
hospital.
System intersect with how does that happen?
I mean, these are all little small projects that I think can grow and blossom, right? But I think there's real interest in that, and I did a study in Philadelphia during fellowship where I talked to patients, community residents really, about their incentives, about the things that promote healthy food production and the things that get them to eat otherwise. Yeah. And one of the things I heard, we did a whole wide swath of patients. In the older patients, predominantly, they were from the South. They were from farming traditions. They had grown crops as kids. They had they still engaged in gardening, and they were involved in food production. Whereas as you go through the generations, there's a loss of that food production knowledge. There's a loss of that food preparation knowledge. There's increased reliance on convenience and processed and packaged items. And so bringing that back, there is a knowledge base there, right? I mean, so the old heads in these communities were very much in favor of producing food and growing food and community gardening. And I think get really excited when there are initiatives like that where, they don't have to rely on the food industry to, supply, these almost unrecognizable, things that they would never have eaten as kids, but now have become part of their, regular dietary pattern, in old age because, our food system has changed so dramatically. So I think, there is opportunity there.
It's huge.
And you get kids involved and they love it.
They love gardening. They love growing
they're
food.
astounded, but they can't believe that food grows on a plant.
Yeah, my daughter thought we grew eggplants. She was like, "Where's the egg?" She was like,
"Yeah,
I'm gonna pick this. Maybe it's the egg."
No, but when you see a piece of fruit on a plant, and like the earth, the soil, the plant produce that you eat. Because otherwise their whole conception is divorce. It comes in a shrink wrapped package that they open up in the store, and they think, fruit comes from a can or fruit comes from a jar. No, fruit comes from the plant. It comes from the earth, and you can grow it, and you can be self-sufficient, and you don't have to rely on industry to provide you with inferior product. You can, be a part of that. And so in urban landscapes, that's more of a challenge. I mean, there's space issues and stuff, but there are definitely lots that have been converted.
Sure, got to bring in soil from the outside. It's amazing. Making this point, it sort of stimulates me to think about the victory gardens in World War II. So many people aren't aware that 40% of our food during World War II was produced from people's own home gardens. And, we were at war. And in a sense, we're at war now. I mean, if there was another country that was causing 70% of our population to be obese, 1 in 2 people have chronic disease, that was costing literally 84% of our 20% GDP that's used for chronic disease, we'd be at war. If another country was doing to our kids what we're doing and the food industry is doing, we'd be at war. So maybe we need to think about the victory gardens a little bit differently here and say, well, let's re-engage people in the growing and production of food. We used to have 50% of people on farms. Now we have less than 2. Yeah. And I think it's not that hard to grow stuff. Obviously you can't grow all your own food,
I don't think we have to necessarily transition back to an agrarian society. No. However, there are opportunities. So even when there aren't, lots or soil available on land, there are all kinds of rooftop gardening, which have, benefits not only for food production, but also like community beautification and socialization and heat retention.
Have you been to the Grange in Brooklyn and the big rooftop garden there?
I haven't, but I've seen it and I know. Yeah, I've been to a similar setup in Chicago, and it's unbelievable. There are also indoor growing options, growing walls and things. There's a Bronx teacher, Steve Ritz, who's become very famous, and he does a lot of work with food production and getting kids engaged in, taking ownership of their food. And he does a lot with like green walls and, indoor growing options, which are, perfectly viable and something you can do even in the city. And require a lot less resources than people think, and, can be beneficial on multiple fronts.
So you're not just sort of conceiving of these things, you're actually implementing these things in the Bronx and poor communities. What changes have you seen as a result of that?
Locally, so with our programs around our clinic, with like the bodega or small store redesign, with the fruit and vegetable prescription program, with the farmers market, with the community gardens. We've also done things like bodega walks or grocery walks where, you go out with a nutritionist or a doctor into the store, you do kind of a guided tour of the shelves, how to read a label, how to look
Hopefully
at
it's a doctor who knows something about nutrition.
Yes, exactly.
It's you and one other guy in Bronx.
Right. People motivated and educated and informed to do this kind of work. But through that, patients become more engaged, more involved, more aware, more motivated, and better prepared, better able to navigate these challenging environments.
If you loved that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here. We also think for so many years that fat causes you to be fat, but it's actually not fat that causes you to be fat. It's starch and sugar. And not just any kind of sugar. We're going to talk about fructose in a minute and why it's such a unique factor in fatty liver